Welcome to Wickless Night. There is something different about a night with no light at all, no candle burning, no lamp in the corner, just darkness, silence, and the feeling that something may be closer than it should be. Tonight's stories come from people who lived through moments they still cannot explain. A sound in an empty room, a stranger at the door, a shadow that moved when no one else was there. Before we step into the dark, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy slow, unsettling, true horror stories, subscribe to Wickless Night. Get comfortable. The lights are already gone.
We had a dog who was about as far from intimidating as a 110-pound animal could possibly be. She was huge, but she was basically a marshmallow. Most of her day consisted of sleeping. She even had her own couch. That was the kind of dog she was. She was not constantly alert, pacing around the house, barking at every sound outside, or acting suspicious around people. If anything, she was lazy. She liked being comfortable, being around us, and sleeping for ridiculous amounts of time. She was also extremely familiar with everyone who lived in the house. There were no strangers involved in what happened. That is probably the main reason the incident has stayed so strange to me. At the time, my wife and I were living in a long shotgun-style townhome. The layout was basically stretched from one end to the other. The dog's couch was toward one side of the place, while the kitchen was on the opposite side. Because of the layout, if somebody came out of the kitchen and walked toward the living room, you could see them coming for a decent distance. There were several of us in the house that day. My wife was there. A good friend of ours was there. I was there. Our roommate was in the kitchen making food. The dog knew this roommate extremely well. He was not a visitor. He was not someone she tolerated, but distrusted. She had lived around him. She knew his smell, his voice, his footsteps, his normal movements around the house. There had never been any reason to think she considered him threatening. The rest of us were gathered in or around the living room near where the dog was sleeping. We were making toast and talking. Nothing about the situation felt tense. The dog was asleep on her couch. And when I say asleep, I mean completely out. She had no interest in what anyone was doing. She was not watching the kitchen. She was not growling under her breath. She was not sitting upright with her ears focused on the roommate. She was sleeping like she normally did. Meanwhile, our roommate was making his own food in the kitchen. At some point, he came out holding a piece of toast. He was looking down at it as he walked. Again, completely ordinary. I do not remember anyone paying much attention to him at first. Why would we? He lived there. Then the dog woke up. And instantly, everything changed. She came off that couch like she had been launched. No slow waking, no stretching, no confused look around the room. She went from dead asleep to a full sprint directly toward our roommate. She started barking and growling. Not playful barking. Not the kind of noise a dog makes because someone has food. This sounded aggressive. Seriously aggressive. She charged toward him with enough intensity that for a moment I genuinely thought she was going to attack him. That was how extreme the reaction was. I had never seen her behave like that toward a human being. Not once. The only comparison I had was one other dog she had reacted badly toward in the past. That was it. Humans? Never. And certainly not this roommate. Everyone froze. Our roommate looked horrified. Understandably, imagine living with a 110-pound dog that has always known you, and suddenly having that dog wake from a deep sleep and charge you like you have become a threat. He stopped. The dog was still focused on him. Then he looked at the piece of toast in his hand. That was when he showed us what he had done. He turned the toast around. On the side we had not been able to see, he had drawn a pentagram in sriracha, a red five-pointed symbol on toast. He had apparently done it as a joke. There was no ritual going on. No one had been trying to summon anything. As far as I know, he had simply been messing around with his food and decided to draw a pentagram with hot sauce. Until he flipped the toast toward us, none of us could see it. That detail is important. The roommate had been looking down at the toast while walking out of the kitchen, and the side with the symbol was facing him. From where we were positioned, the dog should not have had any obvious visual view of the design either. At least, that is how it appeared to us. Then, he wiped the sriracha off. The dog's behavior stopped, almost immediately. She lost interest. No continued barking. No suspicious pacing around him. No refusal to approach. She simply walked away. Went back toward her couch, lay down, and acted like nothing unusual had happened. The entire thing was over almost as quickly as it started. We were left standing there trying to understand what we had just seen. There is an obvious supernatural version of the story. The dog somehow sensed the pentagram. She recognized something evil or dangerous connected to it. She reacted to the symbol even though she could not see it. The second the symbol was destroyed, whatever had bothered her disappeared. It certainly looked that way in the moment. The sequence was almost too perfect. Dog, asleep. Roommate enters holding hidden pentagram. Dog becomes violently aggressive. Pentagram revealed. Pentagram wiped away. Dog immediately returns to normal. If you wanted to tell the story as evidence that animals can sense supernatural things humans cannot, that sequence would be hard to improve. But I am not convinced that is what happened. For one thing, a pentagram is a human symbol. Dogs do not naturally know what one means. A dog has no cultural understanding of occult imagery. It does not know the difference between a pentagram, a star, a circle, a smiley face, or random lines drawn in sauce. For the symbol itself to trigger the dog, you would have to assume something beyond normal perception was involved. Maybe that is what happened. I cannot prove it did not. But before making that leap, there are several ordinary things worth considering. The biggest one is smell. Sriracha has an extremely noticeable smell. To us, it smells like hot sauce. To a dog, whose sense of smell is far stronger than ours, it is probably much more intense. There is chili, vinegar, garlic, other strong ingredients. A dog does not need to see the sauce to know it is there. The roommate could have walked out holding the toast with the pentagram side facing completely away from the dog, and she would still have been able to smell whatever was on it. That gives us an immediate, non-supernatural explanation for how she could react to something we thought was hidden. The problem is explaining why the smell would make her aggressive. She had presumably smelled food before. Probably toast, probably sauces, maybe even spicy food. Why this time? It could have been something unusually strong about the amount of sriracha. Maybe he had used much more than a normal person would put on toast because he was drawing a large symbol. Instead of a thin spread, there may have been concentrated lines of sauce. That could create a stronger smell. Maybe something in it irritated her nose. Maybe she associated a particular ingredient with something unpleasant. Dogs can develop strange associations that humans never notice. One bad experience with a smell can matter. Maybe she had once gotten too close to hot sauce and experienced irritation. Maybe a similar smell had been around during an unpleasant event. We would have no way of knowing. There is also the possibility that the reaction was not actually directed at the toast. The timing may have been coincidence. The dog was sleeping deeply. Our roommate walked out of the kitchen. Maybe something about his movement startled her awake. He was looking down instead of toward her. Perhaps his posture looked unusual. Maybe he carried himself differently because he was carefully holding the toast. Maybe he walked more slowly. Maybe his shoulders were hunched. Maybe the smell of the food woke her at exactly the same moment his silhouette entered her field of view. A dog waking suddenly can be confused for a second. Sleep startle reactions are real. An animal can wake and respond defensively before it is fully processed who is nearby. With a 110-pound dog, even a few seconds of confusion can look terrifying. Maybe she woke, saw a human shape approaching, and reacted before recognizing him. Then, by the time the roommate stopped and showed us the toast, the dog was already beginning to realize. Oh, it's him. The wiping of the pentagram may have happened at the same moment her recognition finished. To us, it looked causal. Symbol removed, dog normal. But perhaps both events just happened close together. That is one of the hardest things about strange experiences. Sequence looks like cause. Something happens. Then another thing happens. Our brains connect them. Pentagram appears. Dog attacks. Pentagram disappears. Dog stops. It feels almost impossible not to connect those events. But timing alone does not prove the symbol mattered. There may also have been body language cues from the roommate that we did not notice. Dogs are extremely sensitive to human movement. The roommate was looking down at the toast. Maybe he was laughing to himself. Maybe he had a strange expression. Maybe he was trying not to spill sauce. Maybe he was walking stiffly. Maybe the dog saw the angle of his shoulders and interpreted it as threatening. Humans tend to think dogs recognize people like we do. Face, voice, identity, and they certainly can recognize familiar people. But their reactions are also strongly influenced by movement, smell, posture, clothing, and context. A familiar person moving strangely can briefly become unfamiliar. There are plenty of stories of dogs barking at their own owners because the owner comes home wearing a motorcycle helmet, costume, oversized coat, or something else that changes their outline. Once the dog identifies the person, it calms down. Maybe something similar happened here on a smaller scale. Our roommate did not look dramatically different to us, but perhaps the dog had just woken and saw only a partial image. A man coming out of the dark side of the room. Head down, object held in front. Strong, unfamiliar smell. That may have been enough. The fact that she had been sleeping is probably more important than it seemed at the time. Had she been sitting awake and watching him make the toast, then suddenly attacked only when he drew the final line of the pentagram, that would be much stranger. But she missed the lead-up. From her perspective, the world may have gone from sleep to person approaching. Strange smell, unusual posture. She reacted immediately. That is a much more understandable pattern. There may also have been another sound, something from outside. A noise in the kitchen, a knock, a vehicle. Something one of us did not consciously register. The roommate walking out happened at the same moment. The dog woke already alarmed and fixed onto the first moving target. That target happened to be him. Dogs sometimes redirect arousal. An animal hears or smells something it cannot reach, becomes highly activated, and reacts toward a nearby person or animal. Maybe the actual trigger had nothing to do with the toast. We would never know, because everyone focused on the most visually interesting detail afterward. The pentagram. Once he turned the toast around, the whole event suddenly had a story. Before that moment, why is the dog freaking out? After, oh my God, she is reacting to the pentagram. That interpretation arrived immediately. And once it arrived, every detail fit. She could not see it. She sensed it. He wiped it away. She stopped. That is exactly the kind of pattern the human mind remembers very strongly. The hidden nature of the symbol is what makes it so creepy. If the pentagram had been facing the dog, the obvious explanation would be visual. Maybe the red lines looked like something strange. Maybe the shape confused her. But if she genuinely could not see it, then vision cannot explain the reaction. Smell still can. And smell is something humans consistently underestimate when thinking about dogs. To us, the important feature of the toast was the shape. To the dog, the shape may have been completely irrelevant. She may have perceived bread. Strong garlic, vinegar, pepper, human hand, movement, heat, maybe something else we did not notice. We were staring at geometry. She was experiencing chemistry. That could completely change the meaning. There's also the question of whether wiping off the symbol actually removed the thing she was reacting to. If the roommate wiped away most of the sriracha, the smell would immediately become weaker. Not completely gone, obviously, but reduced. So the apparent supernatural test has an ordinary equivalent. Pentagram intact takes lots of strong sauce. Pentagram wiped away takes much less strong sauce. Dog calms down. That fits almost as neatly. Maybe she hated the smell. Maybe it irritated her. Maybe she interpreted the concentrated odor as something threatening. Still, would an unpleasant smell really make a gentle dog charge and growl at a familiar roommate? That is the weakest part of that explanation. Dogs usually move away from smells they dislike rather than attack the person carrying them. But animals do not always respond predictably. And perhaps smell was only one part of the trigger. Startle plus smell plus unusual movement could produce a much stronger response than any one element alone. Maybe she woke confused, saw him, smelled something intense, went defensive, then quickly settled once she recognized him. The wiping of the sauce happened during that transition. There is another possibility that sounds trivial, but could matter. Maybe the roommate himself reacted differently once he realized the dog was charging. Before that, he may have continued walking toward her while looking down. Once she barked, he stopped, turned the toast, probably changed posture, maybe stepped backward, maybe spoke, maybe his whole body became less forward moving. That alone could make the dog stop. Then he wiped the sauce. From our perspective, wiping the pentagram was the key action. From the dog's perspective, the key action may have been the approaching person stopped approaching. That is a very different interpretation. If a dog feels threatened by someone moving toward it, stopping can immediately reduce the threat. She may have barked and growled specifically to make him stop. He stopped. It worked. Then she disengaged. That would be completely normal canine behavior. The fact that she had never done it to a human before makes the event unusual, but not impossible. Every animal has a first unexpected reaction. One unusual event does not necessarily reveal a hidden pattern. If she had reacted every time someone drew occult symbols, that would be different. If we could repeat the experiment under controlled conditions, and she consistently became aggressive only when a pentagram was drawn, regardless of smell, position, person, or material, then I would have a much harder time explaining it normally. But we did not do that. And honestly, I am glad we did not deliberately provoke a 110-pound dog to find out. One incident is all we have. The word pentagram also carries a lot of cultural weight for humans. If the roommate had turned the toast around and revealed a smiley face in sriracha, would we have connected it to the dog's behavior? Maybe we would have laughed and said, "She really hates your toast." If it had been a 5-pointed normal star, perhaps the event would barely be remembered. But a pentagram automatically feels sinister to many people because of horror movies, occult stories, religion, heavy metal imagery, and everything else attached to it. So the second we saw the symbol, it transformed the dog's reaction. The event became supernatural looking because the symbol already had supernatural associations in our minds. The dog did not need to understand any of that. We did. That is probably why the story stayed with us. There is also the chance that our memory of how quickly she calmed down has become slightly compressed. Maybe she barked for several more seconds. Maybe she sniffed around. Maybe the roommate wiped the toast. Then someone spoke to her. Then she relaxed. Years later, those steps become, he wiped it off and instantly she walked away. That is not lying. Memory simplifies sequences, especially when the simplified version creates a striking cause and effect moment. Symbol gone. Dog calm. It is a perfect ending. Real events are often a little messier. I cannot say whether that happened here. Maybe it genuinely was almost immediate. But it is worth considering. The detail that the dog knew the roommate so well remains the strongest reason the reaction felt wrong. This was not a dog warning off a stranger. She had no history of human aggression. She had shared a home with him. That means she had an enormous amount of sensory information confirming who he was. His smell, his footsteps, his voice, his general shape. So why did all of that seem to disappear for those few seconds? Sleep startle is one answer. Dogs can wake abruptly and react before fully orienting themselves. If she was genuinely in deep sleep, the switch from unconsciousness to defensive action may have been almost automatic. Maybe her brain recognized the threat-shaped movement first and the familiar person second. That would explain why it looked so extreme and then ended so completely. Once recognition happened, there was no reason to stay upset. She walked back to bed. That is almost exactly what you would expect if the initial reaction was a mistake. The fact that she went right back to sleep may even support that. A dog convinced something supernatural or dangerous was still present might remain agitated. Sniffing, watching the roommate, refusing to settle. Instead, she seemed satisfied almost immediately that there was no problem. That suggests her nervous system had made a brief error rather than detected a continuing threat. Of course, someone who prefers the supernatural interpretation could say the threat disappeared when the pentagram disappeared. Again, both stories fit the same ending. That is why the event cannot really prove either one. What we would need is repetition. Different shapes, same amount of sriracha, same roommate, same walking posture. Dog awake versus asleep. Pentagram hidden versus visible. But nobody was going to turn our living room into a paranormal dog experiment. And even if we tried, expectation would make the results difficult to interpret. So the moment stayed what it was. One bizarre incident. A normally gentle giant dog waking from a dead sleep and acting as if a familiar person had suddenly become dangerous. The roommate standing there, confused and frightened, then showing us the hidden drawing. That red pentagram probably looked much more dramatic because of everything that had just happened. I can imagine the silence when he turned it around, everyone's brain arriving at the same uncomfortable idea. No way. The dog reacted to that? Then he wiped it off. And she left. Even if I believe the most ordinary explanation, I cannot deny how perfect the timing looked. That is what gives the story its power. If there had been a 5-minute gap between the dog calming and the toast being wiped, there would be no connection. If the dog had already been awake and agitated before he entered, no connection. If she had frequently growled at the roommate, no connection. Instead, everything aligned. A hidden symbol already associated with something dark. A sleeping dog suddenly behaving completely out of character. The symbol erased. Dog normal. It is almost designed to make people believe animals can perceive things we cannot. And dogs absolutely can perceive things we cannot. Just not necessarily spirits. They hear frequencies we miss, smell substances at concentrations we cannot detect, notice tiny movements, pick up changes in human posture and emotion. They can react to something real that remains completely invisible to us. That alone is enough to make their behavior look mysterious. Maybe our dog smelled something on the toast that meant nothing to us. Maybe she heard something behind the roommate. Maybe she detected an animal outside. Maybe the roommate had a different scent on him from cooking. Maybe the sriracha itself was the key, but not the shape. We saw one symbol. She experienced the whole sensory environment. That is probably the biggest reason I hesitate to call it paranormal. We do not know what the dog perceived. We only know what we perceived. A pentagram. Those are not the same thing. I have also wondered whether the dog's prior aggressive reaction to another dog tells us anything. Maybe she had some instinctive trigger around posture or scent that we simply had never seen activated by a human. If the roommate came toward her with his head down and shoulders positioned a certain way, perhaps for one confused moment his silhouette resembled an approaching animal. That sounds strange, but dogs interpret bodies differently than we do. The difference between friendly and threatening can be subtle. Direct approach, eye position, body stiffness. Speed, if she woke halfway through the approach, she may have missed the familiar beginning and reacted only to the final posture. Then, recognition corrected everything. Again, plausible. There is also a funny possibility. Maybe the dog was reacting to the food because she wanted it, and frustration somehow turned into barking. But the growling and charging were apparently far beyond normal food excitement. If a 110-pound dog regularly reacted that way to toast, we would have noticed. So I do not think simple food motivation explains it. The event stood out precisely because it was outside her normal behavior. That is something I do not want to rationalize away completely. She really did something unusual. The goal is not to pretend it was ordinary. The goal is to separate unusual from supernatural. Those are not the same. Dogs can have one-off behavioral reactions. People do too. Sometimes we wake from a nightmare and briefly do not recognize our own room. Sometimes someone says our name from behind and we jump much harder than expected. Sometimes the nervous system makes a mistake. Animals have nervous systems too. Maybe hers made one that day. One thing I am glad about is that nobody tried to punish her immediately. From her perspective, whatever happened apparently felt serious. She was not being malicious. She reacted to something. Maybe a confusing perception. Maybe a smell. Maybe a startle. Then, once the moment passed, she went right back to being herself. That is actually a reassuring ending. She did not develop aggression afterward. She did not begin attacking people. The roommate did not become a target. The dog did not keep staring at the area where the toast had been. There was no larger pattern. If this were the beginning of a supernatural haunting story, you would expect escalation. More reactions, strange noises, the dog refusing certain rooms, more symbols causing problems. Nothing like that happened. At least, not in the story as I remember it. That isolation makes coincidence or a one-time behavioral event much more likely. But isolation also makes the moment impossible to test. That is the trade-off. No pattern means less evidence for anything strange, but also no chance to recreate the conditions and identify what happened. The mystery survives precisely because it happened once. I still think about the hidden side of the toast. That is the detail that makes everyone stop. If she could not see the symbol, how could she react to it? The rational answer is simple. She did not need to react to the symbol. She may have reacted to the smell. the person, the motion, the waking state, or something else entirely. Humans made the symbol the center because humans care about symbols. Dogs do not. That explanation makes sense to me. But I understand why the event felt much stranger while standing in that room. There is a difference between analyzing something years later and seeing it happen. In the moment, nobody is thinking about canine olfaction or sleep-startle responses. You are watching a massive, gentle dog sprint at someone she loves. The roommate looks terrified. Then he turns over the toast. Red pentagram. Everyone realizes what they are looking at. He wipes it away. The dog loses interest. There is almost no way not to feel a little cold after that, even if you are skeptical. Maybe especially if you are skeptical, because now you are trying to force an ordinary explanation into a sequence that looks deliberately supernatural. That is how some memories stay powerful, not because there is no rational explanation. Because the rational explanation never feels as visually perfect as the strange one. The strange one is simple. Dog sensed pentagram. The ordinary one is messy. Dog woke startled, smelled concentrated sriracha, saw a familiar person in an unfamiliar posture, reacted defensively, then recognized him and calmed down at roughly the same time he wiped the toast. Messier explanations often sound weaker, but real life is usually messy. We prefer one clean cause. Reality may involve 5 small causes happening together. I think that is probably what happened. The dog had some brief combination of surprise and sensory confusion. The toast happened to contain a symbol that made the moment unforgettable. If the roommate had drawn a flower with the exact same amount of sauce, maybe the dog would have reacted exactly the same way. Then we'd tell a story about the day our dog inexplicably tried to attack someone over a sriracha flower. Nobody would call it supernatural. That thought is probably the best reality check. The symbol mattered enormously to us. We have no evidence it mattered to her. Still, I would be lying if I said the incident never gives me pause. Because the timing was ridiculous. She was asleep, not watching him. He walked out. Immediate reaction. Then the reveal. Then the wipe. Then back to sleep. Maybe chance simply arranged everything in the creepiest possible order. That happens sometimes. A coincidence does not become impossible just because it is good enough for a horror story. And I think that is where I leave it. I do not believe our dog was some kind of detector for evil symbols. I do not believe drawing a pentagram and hot sauce opened anything in our kitchen. Nothing else happened. There is no evidence for that. I think she reacted to something ordinary that none of us identified. Probably some combination of waking suddenly, the smell, and our roommate's movement. But because she had never behaved that way toward him before or afterward, I cannot point to one explanation and say that was definitely it. All I can describe is what happened. A 110-pound dog who spent most of her life sleeping on her own couch was completely unconscious. A roommate she knew extremely well came walking out of the kitchen carrying a piece of toast. She woke and charged him hard enough that I thought we might have to physically stop her. He froze, turned the toast around. And there, on the side none of us had been able to see, was a pentagram drawn in bright red sriracha. He wiped it off. The dog immediately disengaged, walked back to her couch, lay down, and went back to being the same lazy, harmless marshmallow she had been a few seconds earlier. Maybe she smelled the sauce. Maybe she woke confused. Maybe the timing was nothing more than coincidence. Those explanations are all more likely than anything supernatural. But every time I picture that huge dog going from dead asleep to full aggression, then calming almost exactly When that hidden red symbol was erased, I still understand why everyone in the room looked at that piece of toast and thought, for at least one uncomfortable second, what exactly did she think she was seeing that we couldn't? When I was around 11 or 12, I went to a sleepover with some girls from my basketball team, and that night gave me one of the strongest childhood fears I can remember. Before that sleepover, I had never really watched horror movies. I knew what scary movies were, obviously. I had seen trailers, creepy commercials, maybe clips here and there, but I had never actually sat through a proper horror movie from beginning to end. So I had no idea how much one could get into my head. The sleepover itself was completely normal at first. A bunch of girls from the team together. Food, talking, laughing, probably gossiping about school and basketball, staying up later than we were supposed to. Then someone decided we should watch horror movies. At that age, you do not want to be the person who says, "No, I'm too scared," especially around teammates. So even though I was nervous, I stayed. One of the movies we watched was The Ring. That was a mistake. For anyone who has seen it, you probably already understand why it would be terrifying to someone watching their first horror movie at 11 or 12. There is the cursed videotape, the phone call, the warning that you have 7 days. Then Samara, the pale girl with the long, dark hair who eventually crawls out of the television. At that age, the whole movie felt much more believable than it should have. I knew, logically, that actors were involved. I knew someone had made the movie. I knew movies were not real. But childhood logic and childhood fear do not always cooperate. The movie gives you rules. You watch the tape. You get the call. 7 days later, she comes for you. That structure was what really got to me. If it had just been a random ghost jumping out at people, I might have been scared for one night. But The Ring gave me a countdown. 7 days. That meant the fear could follow me home. I remember leaving the sleepover with that number already sitting in my mind. 7 days. I started thinking about whether watching the movie somehow counted as watching the cursed tape. I know how ridiculous that sounds now. But I was a kid. The movie had just spent all that time telling me that watching certain images caused something horrible to happen. Then, I had watched those same images. So some little part of my brain thought, what if that was enough? Once that thought got in, I could not get rid of it. I became hyper-aware of anything connected to the movie. Water, television, static, phones, long dark hair. Wells, anything remotely similar became important. And then, things started happening around me that seemed to match the movie. That was when I really started believing I might be in trouble. One of the things I remembered about Samara was water. Water seemed connected to her. So shortly after the sleepover, after one of our basketball practices, something happened in the locker room. The washing machine burst a pipe. Water went everywhere. That was probably the first coincidence that really scared me. A pipe bursting is not supernatural. Washing machines use water. Pipes fail. Connections come loose. Old hoses split. There are 100 normal reasons for something like that to happen. But I was not thinking like that. I was thinking water. Samara. The movie. 7 days. To me, it felt like the first sign. I remember seeing the water and immediately connecting it to the movie. That connection probably happened before I had time to think of any other explanation. The fear was already waiting. All it needed was something to attach itself to. The fact that the pipe burst around my basketball team made it even worse. These were the same girls I had watched the movie with. So now it was not just happening to me. It felt like something was happening to all of us. We had watched the movie together. Now water was suddenly flooding part of the locker room. At 11 or 12, that felt like evidence. I do not remember whether the other girls were as frightened as I was. Maybe some of them joked about it. Maybe somebody said something like, "Oh my God, it's the ring." If they did, that probably made my fear worse. Even as a joke, hearing someone else make the connection would make it feel less like something I had invented privately. That is how group fear can grow. One person notices a coincidence. Another person laughs and references the movie. Now everyone has the same idea. Even if nobody actually believes it, the connection becomes memorable. I started seeing Samara everywhere after that. Not literally standing in rooms all the time, more like I suddenly noticed her image constantly. Advertisements, games, pictures online, things on my phone, references to the ring. Images of a girl with long, dark hair. It felt like she was following me. Everywhere I looked, something reminded me of her. That was terrifying, because I did not understand how attention works. Now I do. Once something scares you badly enough, your brain starts noticing it much more often. It is the same reason you can learn a new word and suddenly hear it everywhere. Or think about buying a certain car and then notice that exact model on every road. The cars did not suddenly appear. Your attention changed. That was probably happening with Samara. Before the sleepover, I could have walked past an advertisement referencing the ring and ignored it completely. It meant nothing to me. Afterward, the image became one of the most important scary things in my world. So my brain found it immediately. Long black hair, Samara, pale face, Samara, static, Samara, a well, absolutely Samara. The more I noticed those things, the more convinced I became that I was seeing them unusually often. Then, because I believed I was seeing them more often, I paid even more attention. It became a loop. Fear made me watch for signs. Watching for signs made me find more signs. Finding more signs made me more afraid. The whole thing kept feeding itself. At the time, though, I did not think. My attention is primed by a horror movie. I thought, why does she keep showing up everywhere? The phone became another problem. Anyone who knows the movie knows about the phone call. After the cursed video, the phone rings. Then comes the warning, 7 days. Because of that, every phone call suddenly had the potential to be terrifying. If the phone rang unexpectedly, I did not want to answer. I knew it was probably a normal person. Family, someone calling my parents, a friend, some boring everyday call. But what if I picked it up and heard that voice? What if she said I had 7 days? What if the movie somehow worked outside the movie? Again, adult me knows how absurd this sounds. 11-year-old me did not care. Fear does not need a high probability. It only needs a possibility that feels emotionally real. So when the phone rang, I sometimes avoided it. I did not want confirmation. That is interesting to me now. If I had truly believed the curse was definitely real, maybe I would have expected the phone call no matter what. But instead, I behaved almost like avoiding the call could keep the whole thing from becoming official. As long as I did not hear the words, maybe the countdown had not really started. That is a very childlike kind of logic. But when you are scared, rituals like that can feel protective. Do not answer. Do not look at static. Do not think about the well. Do not say her name. Maybe nothing will happen. Then came the incident with my dad. I went with him to feed the cows. Normally, this would have been completely ordinary. I had probably been around that area many times. There was an old well near the barn. I had forgotten about it. Or more accurately, before watching The Ring, the well had not mattered enough to occupy space in my mind. It was just an old well. After the movie, a well was no longer just a well. It was the place where Samara came from. So I went out there with my dad, saw the old well, and completely fell apart. I remember the fear hitting me almost instantly. It was like the movie had suddenly moved into the real world. There it was, a creepy old well, near me. Not on a television screen, not in somebody else's house, on property I actually knew. That was too much. I started crying. My dad had no idea why I was reacting that way. From his perspective, his daughter had gone with him to feed cows and then suddenly started breaking down over a well that had probably been there forever. I probably sounded insane trying to explain it. There is a scary movie. There is a girl. She comes from a well. She kills you after 7 days. Now there is a well here. To an adult, the solution is obvious. The well existed before you watched the movie. It has nothing to do with the movie. But that is not how it felt. To me, finding the well after everything else seemed like another piece of evidence. First the water. Then all the images. Then the phone fear. Now an actual old well. The pattern was becoming too perfect. At least that was what my mind told me. The reality was almost certainly the opposite. The well was always there. I simply did not care about it before. The movie changed what it meant. That is something I understand much better now. Objects do not have to change physically for fear to transform them. A television can be completely harmless for years. Then you watch a movie about something crawling out of one, and suddenly the black screen, after it turns off, looks wrong. A phone is just a phone until a horror movie makes ringing itself threatening. An old well can be part of the landscape your entire childhood and become terrifying overnight because a story gives it a new association. The object stays the same. Your interpretation changes. That was exactly what happened to me. The movie did not create water pipes, phones, advertisements, or wells. It created a connection between those things and danger. Then every time I encountered one, my brain activated the danger response. The 7-day element made everything worse because I believed there was a limited period where something could happen. If the movie had said, maybe someday this ghost will get you, I probably would have forgotten eventually. But 7 days meant I could count. I do not remember whether I literally marked each day. I may have. At minimum, I was aware of the passing time. Day 1, still alive. Day 2, still waiting. Every coincidence during that period felt important. If something strange happened on day 4, it was not just a strange event. It was day 4, getting closer. That kind of countdown makes anxiety much stronger. You know there's supposed to be an endpoint, so your brain watches the world for evidence that the endpoint is approaching. The washing machine pipe bursting probably would have meant nothing on any other week of my life. During those 7 days, it felt like a message. That is why timing can make coincidences so powerful. The event did not need to be rare. It only needed to happen while I was watching for it. Then there was the social embarrassment. I was old enough to know that other people might laugh at me. I was not a tiny child anymore. I was 11 or 12. At that age, you want to think of yourself as mature. You do not want adults telling you that you are scared of a movie. So part of me knew my fear sounded ridiculous. That created a second problem. I was terrified and embarrassed about being terrified. That makes fear harder to talk about. My dad apparently thought I was being crazy when I broke down around the well. I cannot blame him completely. He probably did not understand how intense the fear had become. To him, it was fiction. To me, the movie had already connected itself to real events. The burst pipe was real. The advertisements were real. The well was real. The phone really rang. So every time someone told me the movie was fake, part of me thought, then why does all this keep happening? That is how confirmation bias works when you are frightened. You count the matches. You ignore the non-matches. How many thousands of ordinary things happened during those 7 days? I probably ate breakfast, went to school, played basketball, talked to friends, watched normal television, slept, woke up, did homework. Nothing supernatural happened during most of those hours. But those moments did not matter. They did not fit the story. The burst pipe did. The well did. The phone did. So those became the evidence. My brain built a case from the coincidences while discarding everything that contradicted the fear. The same thing probably happened with Samara's image. Maybe I saw 2 or 3 references over several days. Normally, that would be nothing. After watching the movie, it felt constant. Every one became, there she is again. I probably also misidentified other images as her. Any pale girl with long black hair could become Samara for a second. That visual design is not unique. Long dark hair covering a face appears in other horror movies, advertisements, games, art, costumes, and internet images. But because The Ring was fresh in my mind, I interpreted those similarities through it. That is another way fear spreads. It stops requiring an exact match. Anything close enough activates the same reaction. I remember static being especially bad. Even after I got older and stopped believing anything from the movie could happen, television static still made my stomach drop. That is probably the most lasting part of the whole experience. It is strange because my adult brain can explain exactly why static is harmless. It is just noise on a screen. Older televisions did it all the time when there was no signal. Nothing is coming through it. No ghost is inside. Yet the second I see or hear that particular kind of static, part of my body still remembers the fear. That is how strong associations can be. The rational understanding changes. The physical reaction can remain. It does not mean I still secretly believe Samara is coming. It means my brain learned years ago this sound and image equal danger. That association was repeated throughout a movie while I was frightened. Then I spent days reinforcing it afterward. Every time I saw static and got scared, I strengthened the connection. Years later, the body can react before the adult mind has time to say, relax. It is just static. I think people underestimate how powerful a first horror movie can be when you see it at the wrong age. Adults have years of experience separating fictional language from reality. You understand editing, actors, special effects, music, cues. Screenwriting, you know a movie is manipulating you deliberately. At 11, you may know those facts generally, but still experience the story much more directly. The Ring was especially effective because it used ordinary objects. A television, a phone, a videotape, water, a well. Those are not fantasy castles or alien planets. They exist in normal life. So after the movie ends, you keep encountering the same objects. Every encounter becomes a reminder. That is probably why it affected me so much more than a monster movie would have. If I had watched something about a giant creature destroying a city, I could go home and not see any giant creatures. The environment would reassure me. The Ring followed me home because my home had a television and phone. The barn had a well. The locker room had water. The world itself seemed full of props from the movie. Of course, the props had been taken from ordinary life in the first place. That is why the movie used them. I just did not understand that relationship. I felt like reality was copying the film. Really, the film had copied reality. The well scene with my dad is probably the moment I remember most clearly because that was when the fear became impossible to hide. I could avoid answering the phone privately. I could look away from advertisements. I could worry about the burst pipe in my head. But crying at the well meant another person saw what was happening. My dad knew I was frightened by something he considered ridiculous. I remember the embarrassment mixed with the fear. Part of me wanted him to understand. Another part knew that if I explained the whole 7-day curse, it would sound absurd. That is a hard position for a kid. You need reassurance, but are ashamed of needing it. If someone had calmly explained the pattern to me at the time, maybe the fear would have passed faster. Something like, you watched a movie designed to make ordinary things feel scary. Now your brain is noticing those things everywhere. The washing machine breaking was a coincidence. The well existed before the movie. The phone has rung hundreds of times without anything happening. Seeing references to Samara is happening because you are watching for her. And 7 days is just part of the story. Maybe that would have helped. Maybe not. Fear is often resistant to explanations while it is active. You can understand probability and still feel terrified. That is especially true for children. You can tell a kid there is no monster under the bed. They may believe you intellectually. Then the light goes out, and the floor becomes 5 feet of impossible danger. That is basically what happened to me for an entire week. The movie created a monster under the whole world. Any television, any phone, any water, any well. I could not completely escape the reminders. The fact that nothing happened after 7 days should have ended the fear immediately. And in one sense, it did. I did not die. Samara did not appear. No one crawled out of the television. The countdown passed. Reality won. But the emotional association lasted longer. I had spent enough time frightened that certain images remained contaminated by the experience, especially static. Even after I could laugh about how scared I had been, that visual still made me uncomfortable. It is almost like the body remembers a version of the story the adult mind no longer believes. I can look back now and see exactly how the whole thing built itself. First, horror movie. Strong emotional shock. Specific 7-day rule. Then a perfectly ordinary pipe bursts. Because water is associated with Samara, the burst becomes evidence. Then my attention starts searching for her. I notice more images. Those images become more evidence. The phone rings. I avoid it. Avoidance prevents me from getting the harmless experience of answering and hearing a normal person. So the fear remains unchallenged. Then I encounter the old well. Instead of thinking, this has always been here, I think. There it is. Each step reinforces the last. That is almost a textbook fear cycle, though I obviously did not know that at 11. The most important part was probably avoidance. Every time I refused to answer the phone, I was protecting myself from something imaginary. But my brain learned, good thing you did not answer. Maybe that prevented danger. If I had answered 10 normal calls, eventually the association might have weakened. Instead, avoiding them allowed the possibility to survive. The same goes for static. Looking away tells the nervous system, this thing deserves avoidance. That keeps it powerful. Again, I am describing this with adult hindsight. 11-year-old me was not about to conduct exposure therapy on herself by staring into television static and waiting for Samara. Absolutely not. If someone had suggested that, I probably would have run out of the room. The fear felt too real. I also think sleep probably played a role. Sleepovers already mess with sleep. Kids stay awake late. Horror movies keep the brain activated. Then you go home and sleep badly because every shadow in the bedroom looks wrong. Poor sleep makes anxiety worse. It also makes perception less reliable. You notice movement at the edge of vision. You startle more easily. Normal noises sound louder. then those things become even more evidence that the movie is somehow following you. I do not remember having actual hallucinations of Samara standing in my room. I mostly saw reminders and images, but if I caught something dark moving in the corner during that week, I am sure my mind would have interpreted it in the worst possible way. That is why the phrase "I was seeing Samara everywhere" makes more sense to me now. It probably was not that she literally appeared where no image existed. It was that my attention had become completely tuned to her. Anything resembling her got noticed. The world felt filled with her because I was searching for her even when I did not want to. There is something almost funny about the cow's part now. I imagine my dad trying to do a completely ordinary chore while I am having a breakdown because of a structure near the barn. To him, the well was probably boring, maybe inconvenient, maybe something he had walked past hundreds of times. Meanwhile, to me, it had become the entrance to a supernatural nightmare. That gap between adult and childhood perception is enormous. I am sure he wondered what was wrong with me. From my side, I probably wondered why he was not more concerned. Could he not see it? There was a creepy old well right there. How was he acting normal? That is the power of context. He saw an object. I saw a symbol. The physical well was the same. Only the story attached to it differed. That story was enough to make me cry. I think this experience also explains why some horror stays with people while other horror does not. It is not always about gore or jump scares. Sometimes it is about whether the movie gives your brain something it can keep finding afterward. The Ring gave me several triggers from ordinary life. That made it portable. I could leave the sleepover. The movie came with me because the world had phones and television screens. I remember television static feeling especially alive after the movie. Before, it was just annoying noise. After, I expected something inside it. A face. Movement, hair, some sign that the scene was about to start, even though I knew the movie was over. That anticipation was probably worse than seeing anything. The screen could remain static for 10 minutes, and my body would still be waiting for a figure. Fear loves uncertainty. Nothing happening does not always calm you. Sometimes it gives imagination more time. The same was true with the phone. The Ring itself became suspense. Before answering, there is a second where you do not know who is there. Normally, that is meaningless. After the Ring, uncertainty became, what if that tiny gap was enough? I have wondered whether the 7-day countdown may have actually helped eventually. Because the movie gave a specific deadline, there came a point where the deadline passed. I was alive. That was strong evidence. If the curse had been vague, maybe the fear would have lasted longer. But once the 7th day ended and nothing happened, I had something concrete. The rule had failed. The movie's own logic disproved itself in my life. I do not remember a dramatic moment of relief. Maybe I simply woke up on day 8 and gradually stopped thinking about it. That is probably how it happened. Fear faded. School continued. Basketball continued. There were new things to worry about. The Ring became just a movie again. Mostly the static stayed. That is the leftover scar, if I can call it that. Not trauma in some dramatic sense, just a conditioned reaction. A little stomach drop, a sudden discomfort, a memory of being 11 and absolutely convinced the television was connected to something dangerous. I can laugh at myself now. I know it was irrational. But I do not think 11-year-old me was stupid. She had just encountered a story designed specifically to create fear. It worked extremely well. Then several coincidences lined up while that fear was still fresh. A burst pipe, media references, an old well, normal phone calls. Those things formed a pattern. Adults are not immune to that either. We do the same thing with different fears. Someone reads about a rare illness and suddenly notices every bodily sensation. Someone hears about burglaries and starts interpreting every nighttime noise as someone outside. Someone learns a particular number is lucky and starts noticing it everywhere. Attention creates patterns. Fear makes the patterns feel important. The childhood version is just easier to recognize afterward because the trigger was a horror movie. At the time, though, the possibility of dying felt serious. That is the part adult me sometimes forgets. I was not just creeped out. I genuinely worried about reaching the seventh day. There was a moment when I thought, this could actually happen to me. That is a huge fear for a kid. Death is already difficult to understand at that age. A supernatural rule makes it worse because there is nothing you can do. You cannot fight it. You cannot explain it to a parent without sounding ridiculous. You cannot call the police. You just wait. That helplessness was probably why I paid so much attention to signs. If you cannot stop the threat, at least you can monitor it. Water, Samara image. Phone, well, each one tells you where you are in the story. Of course, there was no story happening outside my own mind. The universe was not arranging scenes from the ring around me. A washing machine broke. Advertisements existed. My family owned or lived near an old well. Phones rang. Those were ordinary events that would have occurred whether I watched the movie or not. What changed was my ability to ignore them. That is the simple answer. It is also the answer that took growing up to understand. I do not remember exactly what happened to the other girls after the sleepover. Probably nothing. Maybe some of them were scared for a night. Maybe others laughed immediately. Everyone reacts differently. For me, the movie hit at exactly the right age and exactly the right emotional vulnerability. I was old enough to understand the story, but young enough to let the rules leak into reality. That was the worst combination. I sometimes wonder how I would have reacted if The Ring had been my 10th horror movie instead of my first. Probably much better. I would already know the pattern. Scary movie ends. You feel weird for an hour. You go home. Nothing happens. The world resets. But I did not have that experience yet. There was no evidence in my own life that horror stayed safely on the screen. So when coincidences started happening, I took them seriously. The experience actually taught me that lesson eventually. Movies can affect you without being real. Your body can respond to fiction as though something actually happened. You can know a danger is imaginary and still sweat, cry, avoid things, or feel sick. That does not mean the danger exists. It means the fear exists. Those are different. The fear I had was completely real. Samara was not. That distinction is easy now. It was not easy then. Every time the phone rang, my stomach tightened. Every time I saw static, I expected movement. Every long-haired, pale girl in an image made me look twice. The old well nearly broke me. And the washing machine pipe bursting seemed like the universe giving me a warning. In reality, I had watched one very effective horror movie and then spent a week accidentally proving it to myself. I am glad no adult tried to make the fear worse. Nobody told me maybe the curse was real. Nobody played a prank by calling and whispering 7 days. At least not that I remember. That would have absolutely destroyed me. Kids do that sort of thing, though. If my teammates had realized how frightened I was, someone could easily have tried it. Maybe that is another reason I kept some of the fear private. You do not tell other kids exactly what scares you if you think they might use it. The fear felt safer hidden. But hidden fear also does not get challenged. That may be why it grew. I think the part about the washing machine would still creep me out if I were that age again. Not because burst pipes are mysterious, because of timing. That is what coincidences do. If the same thing happened 2 months later, I would not care. But right after watching a movie where water is strongly associated with the supernatural threat, perfect timing. The rational explanation can be obvious, and the coincidence still feel unsettling. Adults experience that too. You dream about someone you have not spoken to in years. They call the next morning. Probably coincidence. Still strange. The brain remembers those matches much more than the thousands of dreams that predict nothing. My ring week was full of matches because I had given myself a huge list of things that could count. Water, telephones, screens, wells, girls with dark hair. Static, that is a lot of opportunities. Something was almost guaranteed to happen. The more flexible the sign, the easier it is to find. I did not know that then. I just knew the world suddenly looked like the movie. When I think about it now, the old well is almost the perfect ending to the whole fear spiral. I had watched a movie where a well was one of the central, terrifying images. Then I went out with my dad and unexpectedly found myself standing near a real old well that I had mentally erased from normal life. It must have felt like stepping directly into the set. No wonder I cried. A rational adult can laugh. A scared 11-year-old sees confirmation. The fact that my dad was standing there probably helped more than I realized. Even if he thought I was being ridiculous, he was there. Nothing came out of the well. We fed the cows. Life continued. That ordinary experience may have quietly weakened the fear. Same with the phone. Eventually, calls got answered. Normal people were on the other end. Static appeared. No one crawled through the screen. Day 7 arrived. Nothing happened. Reality kept providing boring counterexamples until the horror story could not maintain itself anymore. That is probably how most childhood fears die. Not through one brilliant explanation. Through repetition. Night after night, nothing under the bed. Phone call after phone call, no ghost. Television after television, no Samara. Eventually, the nervous system gives up. Mostly, then years later, you see static, and your stomach still tightens for half a second. That leftover reaction is almost funny now. It is like a message from the child version of me. Be careful. We know what happens after static. Adult me answers, no, we know what happened in a movie. But the body reacts before the debate finishes. I do not mind it much anymore. If anything, it reminds me how powerful that first horror experience was. I can watch scary movies now without believing the rules apply to me. I know how the tricks work. I can enjoy being scared instead of thinking I am actually in danger. But I will never experience The Ring as just another movie. It has too much childhood fear attached to it. When I hear the title, I do not first think about the plot. I think about that week. The washing machine bursting after basketball practice. Finding Samara's image everywhere I looked. Refusing to answer the phone. Going out with my dad. Seeing the old well near the barn. Then suddenly crying because, for one terrified second, it felt like the fictional world I had watched at the sleepover had been quietly building itself around me. Nothing supernatural ever happened. No curse, no ghost, no 7-day death. Just a scared kid, several perfectly timed coincidences, and a brain that had become extremely good at finding evidence for the thing it feared most. I know that now. But even after all these years, if an old television suddenly goes to static in a quiet room, there is still a tiny moment before logic catches up. My stomach tightens. My eyes stay on the screen. And some part of 11-year-old me still waits to see if something with long black hair is going to move behind all that noise.
Before the next story begins, thank you for staying here in the dark. If this is your first visit, subscribe to Wickless Night for more true stories made for the late hours, when the world is quiet and every little noise feels important. You can also leave a like and tell me which story has made you look around the room so far. Now, let's continue.
When I was around 15 or 16, there was one night when I was left alone in the house and heard something I still cannot explain with complete confidence. My dad worked swing shifts at the time. Depending on the week or the schedule, he could be working during the day, evening, or overnight. On this particular night, he was on the night shift, so he was already at work. My mom had also recently started her own business, doing 24-hour non-emergency transportation. She would get calls at all kinds of strange hours to take patients from hospitals to nursing homes, care facilities, appointments, or wherever they needed to go. Because of that, even if she was home late at night, there was always a chance the phone would ring and she would have to leave. That is exactly what happened that night. At around 1 in the morning, she got a call. Someone needed to be transported from the hospital to a nursing home. So my mom got ready and left. That left me home alone. At 15 or 16, I was old enough that being alone in the house was not normally a big deal. I was not a little kid who needed somebody sitting in the next room. I could stay up by myself, lock the doors, watch television, go to bed. Normally, I would not have thought twice about it. The house was quiet, but it was my house. I knew every room, every hallway, every normal creak. That night, almost all the lights were off. The television was off everywhere except my bedroom, and as far as I knew, there was nothing else playing. No radio, no music, no other person watching anything. I stayed awake for a while after my mom left. Eventually, at around 1:30, I decided I was tired enough to go to sleep. I turned off my television, turned off the bedroom light. Then, I got into bed. Once the light and TV were gone, the entire house became much quieter. That is always when you start noticing sounds you normally ignore. The refrigerator cycling, a pipe making a small noise, wind outside, maybe a car passing somewhere down the street. The normal sounds of a house at night. I was lying there in the darkness when I heard something that immediately caught my attention. A baby crying. At first, I did not panic. My immediate thought was actually very ordinary. My mom must have left a television on somewhere. Maybe there was a show playing in another room. Maybe an advertisement had a baby crying. Maybe something on a TV had continued after she left. That explanation made sense. So I got up. I started checking. I went through the house looking for anything that could have made the sound. Television, off. Radio, off. Nothing obvious playing. No device that I could hear. No forgotten TV in my mom's room. Nothing. The house was quiet. I stood there for a little while listening. Nothing. That was strange. But I still did not immediately think something paranormal was happening. Sound travels in weird ways at night. Maybe it had come from outside. Maybe a neighbor had a baby. Maybe someone's television was loud enough for the sound to carry. There were plenty of possibilities. So eventually I went back to my bedroom. I got into bed again, turned everything off, lay there in the dark. Then I heard it again. A baby crying. That was when it became creepy. It did not sound like a normal household noise that I could easily explain away. I knew what I was hearing. At least, I knew what it sounded like. A crying baby. And as far as I knew, there was no baby anywhere inside the house. No television playing. No radio. No person who could be making the sound. I stayed in bed listening. The crying continued. I cannot remember exactly how long each time lasted. Maybe a few seconds, maybe longer, but it was enough that I could clearly identify it as crying rather than one random squeak from a pipe. That distinction is important to me. If I had heard one high-pitched sound, I could say the house made a weird noise. But this had a rhythm. It rose and fell. It sounded like distress. The kind of sound your brain recognizes almost immediately because human beings are extremely sensitive to the sound of a baby crying. I remember lying there trying to work out where it was coming from. That can be surprisingly difficult inside a house. Was it down the hallway? Another room? Outside? Was it coming through a wall? The sound seemed close enough to feel like it was inside, but I could not locate it precisely. And there was another detail about our house that made the whole thing much worse. My mom collected porcelain dolls. Not little dolls, not a few decorative figures sitting on a shelf. She had a large collection. Some of them were huge, almost Chucky-sized. The kind of porcelain dolls that look much less innocent at 1:30 in the morning when you are alone. During the day, they were just my mom's collection. Nothing more. I had seen them 1,000 times. They did not move. They did not speak. They were decorations. But after hearing a baby cry in an apparently empty house, suddenly every doll felt different. The faces, the glassy eyes, the old-fashioned clothes, the painted expressions. They were all still exactly where they had always been, but my mind had already changed the atmosphere. That is one of the strangest things about fear. Nothing in a room has to physically change. Your interpretation changes, and suddenly the entire room feels wrong. A porcelain doll that was harmless at noon becomes something you do not want to turn your back on at 2 in the morning. I started thinking about where the crying could possibly be coming from. Maybe one of the dolls had some kind of sound mechanism. That thought crossed my mind. Some dolls do make noises. Some cry. Some talk when you move them. Maybe one of my mom's dolls had a battery-powered sound box I did not know about. But as far as I knew, these were porcelain collector dolls. They were not children's electronic toys. I had never heard any of them make a sound before. Still, when you are alone and hearing a baby cry, your brain searches for anything that could explain it. A forgotten sound mechanism would have been comforting. I would have preferred finding one doll with dying batteries making random crying noises. At least that would have been an answer. But I did not find anything like that. I went back to bed. I tried to ignore it. The crying happened again. Now I did not want to leave the bedroom. That is when fear starts changing your behavior. The first time, I investigated. The second time, I listened more carefully. After that, I was less interested in discovering the source. I just wanted it to stop. There is something deeply unsettling about hearing a baby cry when you know there should not be a baby anywhere nearby. A baby's cry is supposed to have an obvious source. A crib, a parent, a child in another room. When you hear it without the expected context, the sound feels wrong almost immediately. Your brain wants to locate the child. That is probably why I could not simply treat it like another unexplained noise. The sound itself demands attention. Looking back now, there are several normal explanations that I think are much more likely than anything supernatural. The first is that the crying may have been coming from outside. At 1:30 in the morning, the neighborhood would have been much quieter than during the day. That makes distant sounds easier to hear. A crying baby in another house could carry much farther than expected, especially if a window was open somewhere, or if the sound reflected between buildings. At night, when traffic and other background noise decrease, something happening several houses away can suddenly seem very close. I might have been hearing a real baby, just not inside my house. That is probably one of the simplest explanations. The problem is that the sound felt internal. At least, that is how I remember it. But sound direction is unreliable, especially indoors. Walls reflect sound. Hallways channel it. Windows can act almost like speakers for outside noise. A sound entering through one window may bounce off walls and seem to come from a completely different room. If I was lying in bed with one ear partly against the pillow, localization would become even worse. So a neighbor's baby is completely possible. There may even have been a family nearby with an infant that I simply did not know about. At 15, I was not keeping track of which neighbors had newborn children. Another possibility is a television from another house. Television audio can travel strangely at night. If someone nearby was watching a movie or show with a crying child, I could have heard only that particular frequency through the walls or windows. Voices sometimes become muffled enough that you cannot understand words, but a baby's cry cuts through clearly because it is higher pitched. That might explain why I heard crying without hearing normal conversation around it. Maybe somewhere nearby a TV was on. My house was silent. The sound traveled, and because I had already checked every device in my own house, I assumed there was no electronic source anywhere. But the source did not have to be mine. It could also have been an animal. That sounds ridiculous until you hear certain animals at night. Cats can make noises that sound disturbingly human, especially when fighting, mating, or distressed. A cat can produce a high-pitched cry that sounds almost exactly like a baby screaming. Foxes are famous for making human-like screams. Some birds can produce strange calls. Even certain small mammals can sound surprisingly similar to infants. If there was a stray cat outside, maybe that was all I heard. The fact that it happened more than once could fit an animal moving around the property. The sound might seem to come from different places as it moved. At the time, I probably would have rejected that explanation because I knew what a baby sounded like. But our brains are very good at turning ambiguous sounds into familiar categories. Once I decided it was a baby, later versions of the sound would be heard through that expectation. The first cry sets the label, baby. Then every similar noise becomes more baby-like. There is also the possibility of pipes or other mechanical sounds. I find that less convincing because the crying seemed too recognizable. But houses can make bizarre noises. Water moving through plumbing, pressure changing in pipes, a heating system cycling, a valve squealing, something vibrating. If a mechanical noise repeatedly rises and falls in pitch, the brain can interpret it as a vocal sound. There are plenty of recordings where wind through a gap sounds like someone moaning or crying. Without finding the source, you cannot know. Maybe something about the house's plumbing made a sound only when nobody was using water. Maybe the timing after my mom left changed pressure somewhere. Again, possible. The fact that I was tired also matters. It was around 1:30 in the morning. I had decided to go to sleep. I was lying in darkness. That means I may have been close to drifting off when some of the crying happened. Sleep transitions can create incredibly realistic sounds. People can hear their name, a knock, a door slam, music, a phone ringing, someone speaking. Sometimes even a baby crying. The experience can feel completely external. You open your eyes, convinced something happened in the room. Then there's nothing. That does not mean anything is wrong with you. The boundary between waking and sleep is not always clean. The brain can generate dream-like sensory experiences before you are fully asleep or while you are waking. Could that explain the first crying sound? Maybe. But I got out of bed and checked the house. Then returned and heard it again. That makes a purely sleep-related explanation feel less obvious. Still, if I was repeatedly trying to sleep, Each time I lay back down, I could have been entering the same transition state again. And once I was expecting the crying, my brain may have been even more likely to produce or amplify something similar. Fear itself changes listening. When you are waiting for a sound, you hear more. Tiny noises become meaningful. A distant cat becomes a baby. A pipe squeak becomes a whimper. A house settling becomes movement. That does not mean the original sound was imagined. It means fear can reshape everything that follows. The porcelain dolls definitely affected how I interpreted the experience. I do not believe the dolls caused anything. There is no evidence for that. They were just creepy objects in the wrong setting. But imagine the same crying in a house with no dolls. You might think, probably a neighbor. Now add a collection of large porcelain dolls. Suddenly another thought appears. What if one of them is making it? That possibility is irrational, but emotionally powerful. Porcelain dolls already resemble children. Some are designed with very realistic faces. Their eyes reflect light. Their mouths are slightly open. At night, they can create an uncanny feeling because they are human-shaped, but completely still. Add the sound of a baby crying, and the brain naturally connects the two. That is probably what made the event memorable. If my mom had collected model cars instead, I might barely remember the crying today. But she collected giant dolls. So the story got an image to go with the sound. I also think being completely alone made the experience much more intense. If my dad had been in the next room, I would have called him. He would have listened. Maybe said, "That is a cat outside." And suddenly, the mystery would be gone. If my mom were home, same thing. She might recognize the sound immediately. But there was nobody else there to provide another interpretation. Every decision was mine. Do I check again? Do I turn on all the lights? Do I call my mom while she is transporting a patient? Do I wake my dad at work somehow? Do I stay in bed? At 15 or 16, you do not want to call your parents and say, "I hear a baby crying and I'm scared." You know how it sounds. You are supposed to be old enough to stay alone. So you stay quiet. That can make fear worse. There is no outside person to interrupt the story your mind is building. I remember listening from bed. The crying would stop. Then I would wait. The silence after it stopped was almost as uncomfortable as the crying itself, because once it stopped, I expected it to begin again. You start listening harder. Every second of silence becomes anticipation. Then, if a tiny sound happens, your body reacts immediately. That is one reason nighttime fear can spiral so quickly. The environment becomes a test. Is it still there? Where will it come from next? I cannot remember whether I eventually turned the television back on. I may have. That would have been the obvious way to fill the house with normal sound. But the clearest memory is lying there after checking everything and still hearing the crying. I do not remember a dramatic ending. No doll moved, no door opened. I did not find a baby. My mom eventually came home. My dad eventually returned from work. The house went back to normal. Nothing else happened that proved any kind of haunting. That lack of escalation matters to me now. If something paranormal were deliberately trying to get my attention, all it did was imitate a crying baby for one night. There was no repeat pattern that I remember. No voices later. No dolls moving. No unexplained crying every time the house was empty. Nothing, one event. That makes a normal explanation much more likely. Probably a sound from outside. Maybe an animal. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe a sleep-related auditory experience mixed with real house sounds. Those explanations are not exciting, but they fit. Still, the memory feels much stranger than the explanations. That is normal too. A rational explanation does not recreate the feeling of lying alone in a dark house at 1:30 in the morning. When I picture it now, I still see the same things. My bedroom. TV off. Lights off. The hallway beyond the door. Every other room dark. Mom out transporting a patient. Dad working night shift. No one else home. Then that sound. A baby. Crying somewhere in the house. I remember the first time I heard it and how quickly I tried to explain it. Mom left a TV on. That had to be it. I got up almost annoyed with myself for being nervous. Checked, nothing. That was the first crack in the normal explanation. Then going back to bed, hearing it again. That was when the dolls became part of the story. I knew they were there before. But suddenly, I was aware of them. Every one of them. Big porcelain faces sitting silently in the dark parts of the house. It is strange how objects can feel more present when you cannot see them. I did not have to be looking at the dolls. I knew where they were. That was enough. My imagination did the rest. Maybe the crying was coming from near them. Maybe one had some kind of mechanism. Maybe I should go check. Absolutely not. That was the point where curiosity lost. I stayed in bed. As an adult, I would probably handle it differently. First, I would check windows. Listen outside. Maybe step onto the porch, if safe. See whether the sound became louder outdoors. Check whether neighbors had lights on. Look for stray cats. Inspect any electronics. If the sound happened repeatedly, I might even record it. A phone recording could answer a lot. If the crying appears clearly on the recording, there was definitely an external sound. If it does not, that raises different questions about perception or volume. At 15, none of that occurred to me. Phones were not always sitting ready to record everything anyway. I just wanted the sound to stop. I also would not automatically connect it to the porcelain dolls now. They were creepy-looking, yes, but creepy-looking objects do not create baby cries. The dolls were probably innocent witnesses to my own fear. They became guilty only because horror movies have taught us to distrust porcelain faces. There is an interesting psychological reason dolls can feel disturbing. They look human enough to trigger our face recognition systems, but not alive enough to behave like real people. We expect movement that never comes. The eyes seem focused even though they are painted or glass. Expressions never change. At night, shadows exaggerate those features. That is enough to create unease even without anything supernatural. So having a large collection around while hearing unexplained crying was almost the perfect environment for fear. The crying also fits the dolls thematically. If I had heard a man's voice, I might not have connected it to them. A baby crying plus childlike figures made the connection immediate. Again, that is my mind creating a story. The sound itself does not prove any relationship. I have sometimes wondered whether my mom's work played into the fear too. She had just left around 1 in the morning to transport someone from a hospital to a nursing home. Hospitals and nursing homes already carry associations with illness, age, death, and vulnerability. I do not remember consciously thinking about that at the time, but the whole night already had an unusual atmosphere. Most families are asleep at 1 in the morning. Mine was scattered. Dad working. Mom driving a patient. Me alone. That may have made the house feel emptier than usual. There is a difference between being alone at 3 in the afternoon and alone after 1 in the morning. Same building. Same locks. Same rooms. Completely different feeling. At night, you become much more aware that everyone else is somewhere else. And because my mom could not simply come back immediately, I knew I had to deal with whatever I was hearing by myself. That made the crying more personal. I also do not know exactly how loud it was. Memory has probably amplified that part. I remember it clearly enough to identify, But was it loud like a baby in the next room, or faint like one outside? That distinction would help a lot now. Unfortunately, I do not have a reliable measurement. Fear stores meaning better than volume. My memory says baby crying, not approximately this many decibels from this direction. The same goes for how many times it happened. Continued to hear the cries could mean several distinct episodes. Maybe it went on for a while. Maybe there were long gaps. I cannot reconstruct every second now. That matters because repeated patterns can feel more deliberate in memory than they were in real time. Maybe a neighborhood baby cried intermittently for 20 minutes. That would fit perfectly. Maybe a cat made several cries while moving around outside. Also fits. Without exact timing, I cannot choose. What I am confident about is that I checked for the obvious source. I thought a TV had been left on. I checked. It had not. That is why the experience stuck. The first explanation failed. When the first explanation fails, people often jump too far. TV is off, therefore ghost. But there is a huge space between those options. Neighbor, animal, outside television, phone audio from somewhere, mechanical sound, sleep transition, acoustics, any of those could fill the gap. I understand that now. 15-year-old me understood only there should not be a baby crying in this house. Yet I can hear one. That is a very different experience. I also think about how powerful the word baby is. If I had described the sound as a high-pitched wailing noise, it would sound less supernatural. Maybe that is all it was. But once the brain identifies a sound as a baby, it becomes emotionally loaded. Humans are wired to react to infant distress. You cannot completely ignore it. Even people who do not like children will usually notice a baby crying faster than they notice other background sounds. So the sound may have captured my attention much more strongly than a normal environmental noise. And the more attention I gave it, the clearer the pattern felt. Maybe the first cry was ambiguous. By the third, I was listening specifically for a baby. That expectation could sharpen the interpretation. I do not say any of this because I think I imagined everything. I probably heard a real sound. The important question is where it came from. I leaned toward outside. A nearby baby or animal seemed simplest, especially because nothing else happened. No physical evidence inside, no source found, no repeat haunting. The house was not suddenly full of supernatural activity. It was one strange late-night experience in an otherwise normal home. That is exactly the kind of event acoustics and circumstance can create. But the creepy part is what it felt like before I had any of those explanations. I remember getting back into bed after searching the house. Now I knew every television was off. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it removed the only explanation I wanted. I lay there in complete darkness. Then the crying came again. And because I had already walked through those rooms, I knew there was nobody there. No child, no parent, no forgotten television, just the dolls. Rows of large porcelain dolls sitting in the dark where my mother had left them. I knew logically that they were objects. But I also knew I was not getting up to inspect them again. That was where I drew the line. There's always a point in a scary experience where you decide ignorance is better than investigation. Maybe if I had gone out with every light on and followed the sound, I would have found a window where it was clearly louder. Maybe I would have seen a stray cat. Maybe I would have discovered a neighbor's television. Maybe the mystery could have ended that same night. Instead, I stayed in bed. That preserved it. The unexplained part remained unexplained because I stopped looking. I do not regret that. At 15, alone at 1:30 in the morning, staying in my room was not unreasonable. If I genuinely thought another person might be inside, wandering around would have been the wrong move anyway. A crying baby did not suggest an intruder, but I did not know what I was dealing with. So I waited. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep. That detail is almost comforting. Whatever I heard was not enough to keep me awake forever. At some point, exhaustion won. Morning came. Normal life resumed. The dolls were still dolls. No baby appeared. Nothing had changed. That is another reason I think the cause was ordinary. Reality reset as soon as the night ended. But that does not erase the memory. There are sounds that become attached to specific places and times. For me, that crying is connected permanently to the image of an empty house at 1:30 in the morning. Dad gone. Mom gone. Every TV dark. Then a baby somewhere I could not find. The dolls are almost secondary now. They make the story visually creepy. But the real unsettling part is much simpler. I checked. There was no obvious source. Then the sound came back. That is enough. If someone told me the same story today, I would not immediately tell them the house was haunted. I would ask about nearby neighbors, open windows, animals, heating or plumbing, how tired they were, whether the sound changed when they moved between rooms, whether anyone else ever heard it, whether it happened again. Those details could probably narrow it down. In my case, too much time has passed. I cannot go back and recreate the night. I do not know who lived nearby. I do not know whether someone had a newborn. I do not know whether a stray cat was outside. I do not know whether there was a pipe or vent that could carry sound. So I leave it unresolved. Not paranormal, not explained, just unresolved. That is probably the fairest category. And honestly, I think some of the creepiest memories belong there. If I told myself it was definitely a ghost, the mystery would actually become simpler. Ghost baby. Done, but I have no reason to believe that. If I told myself it was definitely a neighbor, I would be inventing certainty in the other direction. I have no proof of that either. All I know is what happened from my perspective. My mom got a call around 1 in the morning and left to transport a patient. My dad was working the night shift. I was 15 or 16 and alone. At about 1:30, I turned off my television and light and tried to sleep. Then I heard a baby crying. I got up because I assumed my mom had accidentally left a TV on. Every TV was off. Every radio was off. Nothing in the house explained it. I went back to bed. The crying continued. And somewhere outside my dark bedroom were my mom's giant porcelain dolls, sitting silently in the house while I tried very hard not to think about them. That is the memory. Maybe the sound came from outside. Maybe it was a cat. Maybe it carried through the walls from another home. Maybe I was more tired than I realized, and part of it happened in that strange space between waking and sleep. Any of those explanations make more sense than a haunted doll. But if you put me back in that exact bed, at that exact age, with the whole house dark and empty, and let me hear that same baby crying again after I had already checked every television twice, I doubt any rational explanation would make me feel much better. Because the part that still bothers me is not that I heard something strange once. It is remembering that I got up specifically to prove to myself where the crying was coming from. I checked the house, found nothing, went back to bed. And then, in the silence, the baby started crying again. Back in high school, a few of my friends and I had a habit of taking walks around our village at night. Most of the time, there was nothing especially interesting about it. We were teenagers, so walking around after dark felt like something to do when we were bored. We would talk, joke around, wander through familiar streets, and sometimes go places that felt a little creepy, just because that made the night more entertaining. One Halloween, we decided it would be a good idea to visit the village graveyard. Looking back, I think the date mattered more than I realized at the time. Halloween already puts certain ideas in your head. Ghosts, monsters, graveyards, things moving in the dark. Even if you are not genuinely superstitious, you are still aware of the atmosphere. You are primed to notice strange things. But at the time, we were mostly having fun. There were a few of us together, including 3 lads and a couple of girls. The graveyard itself was split into 2 levels. There was a lower half and a higher half, with a thick but relatively short wall separating them. The girls went ahead of us. They walked up into the higher section and disappeared into the darkness. We 3 lads stayed closer to the split near the wall, partly because we had lost track of where the girls had gone. We did not want to wander too far in the opposite direction and completely lose them. From where we were standing, we could also still see the road leading out of the graveyard. That mattered because, even though we were trying to act brave, none of us wanted to get genuinely lost in there on Halloween night. So we stopped. We stood near the wall for maybe 5 minutes, talking, waiting, looking around occasionally to see whether the girls would appear again. Nothing strange was happening. The graveyard was dark, obviously, and there were headstones everywhere. At night, headstones can create very strange shapes. Something that is clearly a gravestone during the day can look like a crouching person or animal when you only see the outline. Trees create moving shadows. Bushes look larger than they really are. Your eyes keep trying to make sense of things without enough light. We knew that, at least generally. But I was not standing there actively trying to scare myself. Then, while looking around the lower half of the graveyard, I noticed something. There was a large, dark area moving between the headstones. At first, I thought it was just a shadow. That would have been the obvious explanation. But the longer I looked at it, the more it seemed like an actual physical shape. It was moving, not like a shadow from a branch moving over the grass. It seemed to have volume. It seemed to pass behind and between things rather than simply sliding across surfaces. That was when I started paying real attention. It looked big, very big. My first estimate was somewhere around 7 feet long and perhaps 5 feet high. That is how it appeared from where I was standing. I need to be careful with those numbers now because I obviously did not measure it. It was dark. There were headstones between me and whatever I saw. I did not know the exact distance. So the size is an estimate based on how large the shape looked against the graves. But at the time, I was convinced I was looking at something much larger than a normal dog. The body looked low to the ground, as if it was moving on 4 legs. That is the closest description I can give. Something large, dark on all 4s, moving slowly through the lower graveyard. I remember staring at it and trying to identify it. My brain was going through possibilities. Dog? Maybe, but it looked too big. Deer? Possibly, but the shape did not look right to me. A person crouching? That would be strange. And whatever it was seemed too long. I did not immediately scream. The first reaction was confusion. There is always a moment when something looks wrong, but not yet dangerous. You stare longer because you think a little more visual information will solve it. Then the thing changed speed. It suddenly darted forward, toward us. That was the moment all rational thought disappeared. I panicked. Completely, I remember shouting one long, "She it." Then I ran. There was no attempt to stand my ground, no brave investigation, no waiting to confirm what it was. I just legged it. One of the other lads, who had apparently seen the same thing, ran too. The third lad did not seem to understand what had happened. He was hard of hearing and also had poor eyesight, so he had not clearly seen whatever we were reacting to. But seeing two of us suddenly scream and sprint away from something was enough. He followed. I imagine from his perspective it must have been ridiculous. 1 second we were standing there talking. The next two of us were running as if something was about to kill us. We made it toward the main road. I do not remember the exact route or how long we ran. Probably not very long. Fear makes distance feel different. Once we were out near the road, the immediate danger feeling eased slightly. The girls eventually came out too. They had no idea what had happened. We started explaining. That was when things became even stranger for me. The friend who had run with me described almost exactly what I thought I had seen. A large, dark shape, four-legged, moving in the lower part of the graveyard, then suddenly rushing toward us. We had not had time to coordinate a story. We had not stood there discussing what the creature looked like before running. Our reactions had been immediate. So hearing him describe something so similar made the experience feel much more real. That was probably the moment when I stopped thinking. Maybe I imagined it. There had definitely been something there. At least, that was how it felt. The problem was that our agreement did not convince everyone else. It did almost the opposite. The others thought maybe we had planned some Halloween joke. Or maybe one of us had panicked, and the others simply followed. The fact that our stories matched sounded suspicious to them, rather than convincing. I understand that now. Two teenage boys in a graveyard on Halloween claiming they saw a giant black four-legged creature is exactly the kind of thing people expect to be a prank. But I knew I had not made it up, and my friend seemed genuinely frightened. We did not have a photograph. No video. We did not go back into the graveyard with torches and search, so there was nothing we could show anyone. We left with only the memory. For a while, I tried to make sense of it. The obvious explanation is an animal. That is still where I would start today. Graveyards can attract wildlife, especially at night. They are often quiet. There may be grass, trees, insects, rodents, and places for animals to move without many people bothering them. A deer could easily enter. So could a large dog, depending on the area, perhaps a boar or another animal. The darkness could make a normal animal look much larger than it really was. That is probably the most important point. When you see only a silhouette, your brain has very little information about size. Distance and size get mixed together. A medium-sized animal closer than you think can appear enormous. A large animal farther away can appear smaller. You need known reference points to estimate properly. We had headstones, which seem like reference points, but not all headstones are the same size. And if the animal was moving between them at an angle, perspective could distort everything. Something I remembered as 5 feet high may actually have been much lower. If I was already nervous, my brain could also exaggerate size immediately. Fear tends to make threats feel bigger. There is also the possibility of a large deer. A deer moving slowly with its head lowered can look extremely strange at night. The back forms a long, horizontal shape. The neck and head can disappear against darkness. If antlers are present but not clearly visible, they may make the silhouette seem taller or more irregular. Then when a deer becomes frightened, it can suddenly move very fast. From our perspective, that could easily look like a creature charging us. Maybe it was not actually running toward us. Maybe it was running across our line of sight. At night, direction can be difficult to judge. If an animal moves diagonally, it can appear to be approaching much more directly than it really is. That could explain why we panicked. A large stray dog is another possibility. There are some very large dog breeds. Even an ordinary dog can look huge when its outline is dark and you are viewing it between gravestones. A long body plus low head position can create an almost wolf-like shape. If it started running after noticing us, that would make sense too. Maybe it was curious, maybe startled, maybe trying to get out of the graveyard and happened to move in our direction. We saw intention where there was only movement. That happens easily when scared. There could even have been more than one animal close together. Two dogs moving side by side could briefly look like one enormous shape. One animal passing behind another can create impossible proportions. At night, the brain combines outlines. What looks like one 7-foot-long creature may actually be two ordinary animals overlapping. That is another possibility I have thought about. There is also the chance that what we saw was a person, someone crouching, someone wearing dark clothing, maybe a teenager trying to scare people. It was Halloween. A graveyard was exactly the kind of place where somebody might hide and mess with other kids. A person on hands and knees or bent over could look like a large 4-legged figure in poor light. If they suddenly ran toward us, that would explain everything. Maybe someone knew groups of teenagers visited the graveyard and thought it would be funny to hide there. We never saw the shape closely enough to rule that out. The problem is the proportions. Both of us remembered something long and low. But again, memory is not exact. Maybe a person moving behind several headstones created the impression of a longer body than was really there. There may also have been shadows adding to the outline. The fact that it seemed like a solid thing rather than a shadow is meaningful, but it does not tell me what kind of solid thing it was. I am fairly confident there was some actual object or animal moving. I do not think both of us simply hallucinated the same thing. But shared sight does not prove the supernatural interpretation. It only tells me there was probably a real stimulus. The second part of the story is what made everything much creepier. About a year later, I was with a girl who was new at our school. I had volunteered to tag along while she went to collect her younger sister from the park. My motivations were not exactly mysterious. I thought the new girl was attractive. So when there was an excuse to spend more time around her, I went. Her younger sister was about 10. We got to the park and found her. At some point, she started talking about something she had apparently encountered there. She said she had made friends with a werewolf. That immediately got my attention. At first, I probably assumed this was normal 10-year-old imagination. Kids tell stories, especially about creatures. Then she described it. And what she described sounded almost exactly like what I remembered seeing in the graveyard the previous year. A large, 4-legged creature. Dark, unusual the resemblance was strong enough that I felt genuinely uncomfortable. The park was around a mile or maybe a mile and a half from the graveyard. Not far at all for an animal. That fact made the connection feel possible. The younger girl claimed she had actually spoken with it. That obviously complicates things. Her older sister did not take it seriously. She basically told her it was a good story and left it there. No panic. No belief that her sister had actually made friends with a werewolf. Just a kid telling a strange tale. But I could not stop thinking about the description. She had no reason to know my graveyard story. As far as I knew, nobody outside our small group had really heard it. We did not tell many people because the few reactions we got were mostly disbelief. So when this child described something similar, it felt like independent confirmation. That is the part that haunted me afterward. What if whatever we saw really was moving around the area? What if she had seen the same animal? The rational explanation is still possible. In fact, it may be strengthened. If a large, unusual dog or wild animal lived in or wandered around the village, multiple people could see it in different locations. A mile or so is nothing for an animal. Maybe there was a large black dog that roamed the area. Maybe a deer with an unusual appearance. Maybe some other animal children did not recognize. We saw it in the graveyard. She saw it near the park. Both encounters became monster stories because the animal was hard to identify. That is actually quite plausible. Her claim that she spoke with it may simply have been childhood imagination layered onto a real animal sighting. Maybe she saw a huge dog. It did not attack. It stayed nearby. She talked to it the way children talk to animals. Later, in her mind, the dog became a werewolf, and the interaction became a conversation. Children can blur pretend play and storytelling without deliberately lying. If she was around 10, she was old enough to tell elaborate stories and young enough to enjoy treating them as partly real. Maybe the conversation meant she spoke to it and imagined its responses. That would not be unusual. The part that interests me is whether the physical description came from something she genuinely saw. It may have. A large stray dog wandering between the graveyard and park would connect both stories without requiring anything paranormal. There is another possibility. Maybe the description was not as exact as I remember. This happened a year after my own sighting. I already had a strong mental image. Then a child said, werewolf. Large, dark, four-legged. My mind may have immediately filled in the rest. Years later, I remember she described exactly what I saw. But did she really match every detail? 7 feet long, 5 feet high, same body shape, same movement? Or did she simply describe a big dark werewolf-like animal, and my brain connected it to the graveyard creature? That difference matters. Memory tends to simplify matches. If two stories overlap in a few important ways, we often remember them as identical. The child's story probably became attached to my original memory immediately. Every time I retold the graveyard incident after that, the park story became the creepy final detail. And every retelling may have made the similarity feel stronger. That does not mean there was no similarity. There clearly was enough to bother me. But I cannot guarantee the descriptions were literally exact. There is also the possibility she had heard the story somehow. Villages are small. Teenagers talk. Even if our group did not intentionally spread it, somebody could have mentioned it to someone. The story could travel without us knowing. Those lads saw some huge monster in the graveyard last Halloween. That is exactly the kind of local story children would enjoy. Maybe the younger sister heard a version through another kid. Then she used it in her own werewolf story. By the time it came back to me, I did not know the root. That would explain the similarity. Again, I have no evidence that happened. But information spreads, especially creepy local stories. What feels like completely independent confirmation may not be independent at all. The Halloween setting also matters when thinking about my own sighting. I was already in a graveyard, at night, on Halloween, with stories and expectations around us. That does not create an animal that is not there, but it affects identification. If I had seen the exact same dark shape on a farm in daylight, maybe I would have said, that is a deer. At night in a graveyard, what the hell is that? Environment changes interpretation. The creature starting to move quickly toward us sealed the fear before we could identify it. Once we ran, we lost the chance to correct the image. That is probably the central reason the mystery survived. We never got close, never saw eyes, never heard it bark, growl, snort, or make any other sound that could identify it. Never saw fur color clearly, never saw feet, no head shape, no tail, no antlers, nothing, only silhouette and movement. That is actually very little information. It felt like a lot, because the shape was frightening. But from an identification standpoint, it is almost nothing. Large, dark, four-legged looking. move slowly, then quickly. That describes a huge number of normal animals. A dog, deer, boar, livestock that had gotten loose, even a large goat or pony in some circumstances. The apparent size is the least reliable detail because of darkness and distance. If I remove the 7-foot estimate, the event becomes much easier to explain. We saw a large, dark animal in a rural village graveyard. It noticed us, or was startled. It ran. We panicked. That is probably what happened. But my friend's agreement is still important to me. I was not the only person who saw it. He had a similar reaction without needing me to convince him. That tells me the stimulus was real and unusual enough to frighten both of us. It does not tell me the creature was impossible. That is the line I try to keep. 2 witnesses make me more confident there was an animal or person. They do not turn an unidentified animal into a werewolf. The third friend, not seeing it, is also completely understandable. His eyesight was poor. He was hard of hearing. The encounter was brief. By the time he understood we were running, the thing may already have disappeared behind headstones or into darkness. His lack of observation neither proves nor disproves anything. The girls were farther away in the higher section. They missed the whole thing. So only 2 of us had a direct view. That is enough to make the memory shared, but not enough to give us details we never saw. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we had stayed still. Would the thing have continued toward us? Would it have passed under a light? Would we have suddenly realized it was a large dog? Maybe it would have stopped. Maybe it would have run away. Maybe the entire supernatural feeling would have vanished in another 10 seconds. But there is no way teenage me was waiting for that. When a giant, shadowy animal shape darts toward you through a graveyard on Halloween, curiosity is not winning. Running was instinctive. I do not feel embarrassed about that. Even if it was only a normal animal. Keeping distance from an unknown large animal is reasonable, especially one moving quickly toward you. The only thing I might have done differently would be to look back once I reached a safe distance. Maybe use a torch, see whether it came out of the graveyard. But again, fear makes you want separation, not data. The later werewolf story from the child made me reconsider the original sighting much more seriously than I otherwise would have. Without that, I probably would have settled on big dog or deer. The end. Instead, the second story reopened everything. Same general area, same kind of shape, independent child. A year later. That sounds like a pattern. Patterns are hard to ignore, but patterns can also be created by common animals. If there was one unusually large stray dog in the area, it could easily appear in both places over a year. Maybe local kids had seen it multiple times. Some called it a werewolf. Maybe there was already a local story around the animal that neither I nor my friend knew. That could explain everything. It might even explain why the child treated it as a friend rather than a threat. Maybe she had seen the dog several times, fed it, talked to it. In her imagination, it became a werewolf friend. While we, seeing the same animal only once in darkness in a graveyard, treated it as a monster. Same animal, different context. That is one of the possibilities I like most. There is something almost reassuring about it. Our terrifying graveyard beast might have been some lonely giant dog that a 10-year-old later decided was her magical friend. That would be a much better ending. Of course, I cannot prove that either. There is also the chance that the child was describing something completely imaginary, and the similarity was coincidence. Werewolves are usually described as large, dark, four-legged or partly four-legged creatures. That is already close to my memory. She did not need to know anything about my sighting to invent a generic werewolf that matched. A child's werewolf story matching an ambiguous animal sighting is not statistically impossible. The label itself carries predictable features. Large, hairy, dark, wolf-like. Those traits overlap naturally with the kind of thing two teenagers might misidentify at night. So the second story may feel stronger as evidence than it really is. That is the frustrating part. Every creepy detail has a reasonable counter-explanation. Halloween? Primed fear. Graveyard? Bad visibility and lots of visual obstacles. Large creature? Size misjudged in darkness. Four-legged? Probably an animal. Charged toward us? May have been running across or away. Second witness? Confirms a stimulus, not an interpretation. Child later describes similar creature. Could be same animal, coincidence, folklore, or information spreading. Nothing is impossible. Nothing proves a monster. But put all the pieces together and the memory is still unsettling. That is why I never completely forgot it. I still picture the lower half of the graveyard, headstones breaking up the darkness, that large black shape moving slowly through them. For a few seconds, it was only odd. Then, the movement changed. It came forward fast. The difference between curiosity and panic was instant. I remember my own voice shouting before I even consciously decided to run. Then, feet hitting the ground, my friend running beside me. The third lad following because our fear scared him more than whatever was behind us. Then the road, the girls returning. Us trying to explain, them not believing. That could have been the whole story. One Halloween scare. Then, about a year later, a 10-year-old girl in a park a mile or so away casually telling us about the werewolf she had befriended. That was the part that made the old image come back. I probably stared at her while she talked. She had no idea why her silly story mattered to me. Her sister dismissed it. I said nothing dramatic. But inside I was comparing every detail. Large, four-legged, dark, the same general area. And suddenly I was back in the graveyard. I do not believe now that we definitely saw a werewolf. There is no evidence for that. No photograph, no tracks, no body, no repeated close sightings, no impossible behavior. Whatever we saw behaved exactly like something physical. It moved through the graveyard, then ran. That is what animals do. If anything, the event being so physical makes a normal animal more likely. It did not vanish, did not change shape, did not stand upright and speak, did not survive anything impossible. We simply failed to identify it before running away. That is a much smaller mystery. But small mysteries can stay with you, especially when another person shares them. If I had been the only witness, I might have dismissed it as a shadow. My friend saw enough to run, too. That makes me confident there was something real moving between those graves. I just do not know what. Maybe a big dog. Maybe deer. Maybe an animal whose size and outline got exaggerated by darkness. Maybe someone pulling a Halloween prank. Any of those are believable. And if the younger girl's story was based on the same real animal, then perhaps we were not even the only people who saw it. That still would not make it supernatural. It would just make it a local animal nobody bothered to identify properly. Sometimes I like that explanation. Other times I remember how large it looked, how low it was, how quickly it came toward us. And the logical explanations feel less emotionally convincing than they do on paper. That is the difference between memory and analysis. Analysis says, poor light. Distance, animal, memory says, there was something huge moving between the headstones. Both can exist at once. I think that is probably where the truth is. Something ordinary looked extraordinary because of the conditions. Halloween, darkness, a graveyard. Teenagers already half expecting to be frightened. Then a real animal moved in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. We ran before reality could correct the mistake. A year later, a child's werewolf story gave the memory a second life. That is enough to explain why I am still thinking about it. But every now and then, one question still bothers me. If it really was just a large dog or deer, why did the younger girl's description hit me so immediately? Maybe because memory is good at finding matches. Maybe because the same animal really had been wandering around that part of the village. I honestly do not know. And I probably never will. The graveyard looked normal whenever I saw it afterward. The wall was still there. The headstones were still there. Nothing enormous came running out again. No local werewolf attacks. No strange animal was eventually caught and displayed on the news. Life went on. That is important. Real monsters do not usually leave only one vague sighting in a child's story. Misidentified animals do. So if someone forced me to choose, that is what I would choose. A real animal, seen under terrible conditions, made larger by fear, then remembered through years of retelling. But when I picture that Halloween night exactly as it felt at the time, all of those explanations disappear for a second. I am standing beside that short wall with two friends. The girls are somewhere up in the dark higher section. We are talking and waiting. Then I notice something moving below us, not a shadow on the grass, something between the graves. Long, low, far too large. For a few seconds, it moves slowly. Then it suddenly turns its speed toward us. And before I can decide whether I am looking at a dog, deer, person, or something else entirely, I hear myself scream and start running. A year later, a 10-year-old girl describes her friendly werewolf from a park barely more than a mile away. Maybe those two events had absolutely nothing to do with each other. That is probably the answer. But every time I think about that dark shape slipping between the headstones, I still remember her description too. And for just a second, I wonder whether she had seen the same thing we ran from. Only she had been brave enough, or young enough, not to run. When I was about 15, a friend and I had an experience in our neighborhood park that I still cannot completely explain. It was late, probably around 1 in the morning. We had been out much later than we were supposed to be, just wandering around the neighborhood the way teenagers sometimes do when nobody is really keeping track of the time. At that age, being outside after midnight felt different from being outside during the day. The same streets were quieter. The park felt larger. There were fewer cars, almost no people. And once you moved away from the streetlights, the darkness around the trees became almost solid. My friend and I knew the area well. This was not some remote wilderness we had never visited before. It was our neighborhood park. We had probably been through it countless times. That is part of what made the experience so strange. Nothing about the park itself was supposed to be mysterious. That night, we stopped near the trees because we needed to take a piss. Nothing glamorous about it. We were 15. It was late. The park was empty, so we moved closer to the tree line where we had some privacy. I remember the darkness being extremely heavy around that part of the park. There may have been some distant light from the neighborhood, but under the trees it was basically black. You could see the general outline of trunks and branches, maybe patches of grass. But details disappeared quickly. I am a tall guy. Even back then, I was already well over 6 feet. That detail has always mattered to me because whatever came out of those trees looked enormous compared with me. We had only been there for a short time when something moved. At first, I do not remember understanding what I was looking at. There was just a shape inside the darkness. Then it came forward from the trees. Upright. Very large. My immediate estimate was that it stood around 10 feet tall. I know how extreme that sounds. I also know now that estimating height at night without a good reference point is incredibly unreliable. But in the moment, I was not thinking. Maybe this thing is 7 feet, and perspective is making it look larger. I was thinking, that thing is gigantic. The shape looked human, like in the broadest possible sense. 2 legs, upright body, head, but it was far too big. The closest comparison I could think of was Bigfoot. Not because I saw fur, not because I saw some classic ape face. I did not get anywhere near that kind of detail. It was pitch dark. What I saw was essentially a huge Bigfoot-shaped shadow. That is still the best way I can describe it. A massive dark figure standing upright. And I remember eyes. That was the part that made it feel alive. There seemed to be 2 points where the eyes should have been. I cannot honestly say now whether they were glowing. Maybe they reflected some distant light. Maybe I simply saw lighter patches in the darkness and interpreted them as eyes. But at the time, I was certain something was looking at us. The whole event happened extremely fast. I did not stand there studying it. My friend did not pull out a phone. Neither of us tried to communicate with whatever it was. We ran. There was no debate. No, what do you think that is? No attempt to prove we were brave. We booked it. Completely, I do not even remember deciding to run. One moment, I was looking toward the trees. The next, both of us were sprinting away from the park. We did not look back. That detail matters, because it means we lost the best opportunity to see what the thing actually was. If we had looked over our shoulders after 50 feet, maybe we would have seen it step into a patch of light. Maybe it would have dropped to 4 legs. Maybe we would have realized it was a deer. Maybe it would have turned out to be a person. Maybe it would have stayed exactly as huge as it first looked. We will never know. Fear took over before curiosity had any chance. We kept running until we were far enough away that neither of us felt like something was immediately behind us. When we finally stopped, there was no sign of it. No footsteps coming after us. No huge shape crossing the park. No noise from the trees. Nothing. At first, we were mostly trying to catch our breath. Then came the obvious question. Did you see that? My friend had. That was the moment the experience became much harder for me to dismiss. If I had been alone, I could have told myself almost immediately that I had mistaken a tree or shadow for something alive. But my friend described essentially the same thing. A huge, upright figure, far taller than a normal person. Dark, coming out of the tree line. We both had the same immediate reaction. Run. There had not been enough time for one of us to convince the other what to see. We saw something and panicked together. That does not prove we saw a 10-foot creature, but it makes me fairly confident there was some real visual stimulus there. Something moved. Something looked large and upright. Both of us reacted to it. Once we calmed down a little, something very typical of 15-year-old boys happened. We decided to go back. That sounds stupid now. A few minutes earlier, we were convinced some enormous creature had just come out of the trees. Then, somehow, curiosity became stronger than fear. Maybe being together made us braver. Maybe once we were at a safe distance, embarrassment started kicking in. Neither of us wanted the story to end with, we saw a shadow and ran screaming. We wanted proof. So we returned to the park. Carefully, I remember being much more alert this time. Every sound mattered. Every branch moving in the dark looked suspicious. We went back toward the area where we had seen it. There was nothing there. No giant figure. No person. No obvious animal. We looked around for tracks. That was probably our main idea. If something really stood 10 feet tall and walked out of the trees, surely it would leave some kind of evidence. Footprints, broken branches, disturbed ground. Something. We found nothing. At least nothing we could clearly identify. We were teenagers searching in darkness, so our tracking abilities were basically non-existent. That is important. Saying we found no tracks does not mean the ground was perfectly examined. It means 2 frightened 15-year-olds looked around and did not see giant obvious footprints. The soil may not even have been good for tracks. If the ground was dry, grassy, hard, or covered with leaves, a large animal might leave very little that we would recognize. Still, the lack of anything obvious bothered us. The next thing we did was ask other kids around the neighborhood. Had anyone else ever seen something weird in the park? Any giant person? Any strange animal? Any Bigfoot story? Anything? Nobody had anything useful. No local legend. No repeated sightings. No one saying, "Oh yeah, that thing lives in the trees." Nothing that actually made the whole experience less dramatic in a way. There was no pattern. No monster story waiting for us. No mysterious footprints people found every month. No pets disappearing. No huge creatures spotted by other people. Just our one encounter. That is one of the strongest reasons I do not claim it was Bigfoot. I have no evidence for that. Bigfoot is simply the closest visual comparison I have. Something huge. Upright. Dark. Human-like, but too big. That is all I mean. When I think about it rationally now, the first problem is the size estimate. 10 feet. Could it really have been 10 feet tall? Maybe, but I have to admit that darkness makes size extremely difficult to judge, especially when you cannot see the object's feet clearly. If you see a silhouette against trees, you need reference points. How far away was it? Was it standing on higher ground? Was I seeing branches above its head that looked like part of the body? Was it closer than I thought, farther away? At night, depth can collapse. You can look at something 20 feet away and interpret it as something larger 50 feet away. Or the reverse. Without details, the brain makes guesses. Those guesses can be wildly wrong. Fear probably increased that effect. Something looks unexpectedly large. Your nervous system decides threat. Then every estimate grows. A 7-foot shape becomes 9. 9 becomes 10. I am already tall, so part of what made the experience shocking was that the thing looked significantly taller than me. That much I still trust emotionally. But significantly taller and exactly 10 feet are not the same claim. It could have been a very tall person. A person standing on slightly elevated ground. Someone near a stump or root system that raised them. Someone with a hood or object over their head. All of those could create an enormous silhouette. A person is probably one of the simplest explanations. It was 1 in the morning. We were in a neighborhood park. We were not the only teenagers capable of being outside late. Maybe someone else was there. A tall adult. A drunk person. Someone homeless. Someone trying to scare us. Someone just walking through the trees. If a person emerged unexpectedly while we were already in a vulnerable situation, our brains could exaggerate their size immediately. The problem is that both of us thought the figure looked far too large. But shared mistakes happen when 2 people have the same bad viewing conditions. If a 7-foot person stands on a small rise in darkness, both observers can misjudge the scale. Especially if we were standing close together. We had nearly the same angle, the same lighting, the same tree line behind the figure. Our visual error would likely be similar. The eyes are another interesting detail. Human eyes do not normally reflect light as dramatically as many animals' eyes do, but glasses can. Sunglasses at night would be strange, but Ordinary glasses can catch light. Moisture can reflect. A pale face with dark surroundings can create two bright-looking points where the eyes are. Or maybe what we interpreted as eyes were not on a face at all. Two small, distant lights seen through branches could line up with the silhouette. That would make the figure feel much more creature-like. There is also the possibility of an animal. That explanation sounds less obvious because the thing appeared upright. But some animals can stand on their hind legs. A bear would be the first animal many people think of. A large bear standing upright can look terrifyingly human in silhouette. Depending on species and individual size, some can appear enormous. If this happened in an area where bears were possible, that would be a strong explanation. But I do not remember any bear sightings being normal around our neighborhood. If bears were completely absent from the area, then that becomes less likely. I am also not going to invent local wildlife details I do not remember. Another possibility is a deer. That sounds ridiculous at first. A deer is not shaped like a giant person. But under bad conditions, a large deer standing on its hind legs or lifting its front body can create a very tall vertical silhouette. Antlers can add height. Branches can merge visually with the antlers and make the entire shape even larger. If it dropped back down and moved away, we may have missed that because we were already running. A deer's eyes can also reflect light strongly. Two bright points in a dark tree line are exactly what you might notice first. Maybe we saw a deer at an unusual angle. Our brains supplied shoulders and arms where there were none. That would explain the eyes better than a human. It would also explain why there were no obvious tracks we recognized. Deer tracks are smaller than the giant human footprints we were probably expecting. We may have looked directly at them and ignored them. If we were searching for something Bigfoot-sized, normal hoof prints would not have seemed connected. There could also have been multiple objects overlapping. This is something people underestimate. Imagine a deer standing near a narrow tree. The tree creates the vertical body. The animal creates movement and eyes. Branches create the apparent head or shoulders. For a few seconds, all those shapes line up. The brain combines them into one creature. Then, the animal moves. The entire figure seems to step out of the tree line. That could produce exactly the kind of impossible proportions we remember. Darkness does not show boundaries well. One object can visually borrow pieces from another. A trunk becomes a leg. Branches become arms. An animal's head becomes the face. The result looks like a single giant thing. We run before the illusion has time to fall apart. That is a plausible explanation. There is also the possibility of a large owl or bird involved in the eyes. Again, not as the entire 10-foot shape, but as part of what we interpreted. A bird perched at the right height could provide reflective eyes while branches below formed the body. Then it moved or flew at the same moment some other shadow changed. The brain connected everything. That sounds complicated, but visual illusions often are. Several ordinary things line up for 1 second and create one extraordinary image. A simpler possibility is that the figure never moved as much as we remember. Maybe wind moved branches. A shadow shifted. We interpreted that as something stepping out. Then, because we were both nervous teenagers in a park at 1 a.m, one of us reacted, and the other followed. But I remember the movement clearly enough that I do not think it was only a stationary tree. Something changed position. My friend agreed. So I think there was probably an animal or person involved. I also wonder about our eyes being adjusted to darkness. If we had just come from a brighter area, our night vision may not have been fully adapted. That means black shapes would lose detail. A person in dark clothing could become almost completely featureless. You would see only the outer silhouette. The same goes for an animal. No fur color, no face, no limbs clearly separated, just mass. That matches the memory perfectly. The phrase Bigfoot-looking shadow is almost a description of missing information rather than actual features. I did not see Bigfoot features. I saw a dark, upright shape my brain could not classify, so it borrowed the closest category it had. Bigfoot. That is probably what happened. The figure having eyes makes it feel more specific, but even that may be perception filling in details. When you look at a living shape in darkness, you expect a face. The brain searches for eyes. Two lighter patches appear. Now the face is complete. This happens with ordinary objects, too. People see faces in electrical outlets. Cars, windows, trees. Once the brain decides a shape is alive, face detection becomes very active. But there is another reason I think something real was there. My friend reacted before we had time to talk. He was not simply watching me panic and then later agreeing. We both moved. We both saw enough to get scared. Shared observation is important. It just has limits. It confirms a stimulus better than it confirms the interpretation. If two people see a dark figure, that makes a personal hallucination less likely. But both people can misidentify the same deer. Both can misjudge the same person's height. Both can interpret the same tree and animal combination as one creature, especially standing beside each other. The fact that we went back is also useful. Nothing attacked us. Nothing stayed. Nothing left dramatic evidence. If there really had been a 10-foot unknown primate living in our neighborhood park, you might expect more. Tracks, other witnesses, noises, repeated sightings. Something, instead, nothing, that makes a transient ordinary cause much more likely. A person moved on. An animal left. A visual alignment disappeared. Then, when we returned, the park was just the park again. No monster. I sometimes think about whether going back that same night actually made the story less scary. At the time, probably not. We were searching every dark area, expecting it to reappear. But later, the fact that we could return safely matters. Whatever we saw was not waiting for us. It did not stalk us, did not follow us home, did not attack. It appeared. We ran. It disappeared from our lives. That is much more consistent with accidentally encountering an animal or person than with something deliberately interested in us. The lack of tracks does not prove anything either way. If it was a person, footprints might be ordinary shoe prints mixed with countless others. If it was a deer, we may not have known what to look for. If the ground was grass, there may have been no clear prints at all. And if the creature was actually much farther away than we thought, we may have searched the wrong exact spot. That last possibility is important. At night, distance judgment can be wrong by a lot. We may have returned to the place where we thought it emerged, while the actual animal had been much deeper into the trees. So the search was never as meaningful as it felt. We were not investigators. We were kids. The questions we asked around the neighborhood were probably influenced by the story, too. Have you seen a 10-foot Bigfoot thing in the park? Most people are going to say no. If instead we had asked, have there been any large deer around here? Or, does a really tall guy ever walk through the park at night? Maybe we would have gotten useful answers. But our category was already monster. That shaped the investigation. We were searching for confirmation of the thing we thought we saw, not testing every ordinary possibility. That is natural. When something scares you, you want the world to explain your specific fear. You do not yet know enough to ask neutral questions. I also think being 15 mattered. At that age, you are old enough to move around without adults, but still young enough that an unexplained figure can instantly become something legendary. We had probably heard Bigfoot stories, seen images, knew the basic outline. Huge, dark, human-like. Hairy, lives around trees. So when a large, upright silhouette appeared from a tree line, that category was immediately available. If I had never heard of Bigfoot, maybe I would describe the same thing as a giant man or a weird animal. Labels shape memory. Every time I later thought we saw something like Bigfoot, the memory probably became slightly more Bigfoot-shaped. That does not mean I invented it. It means comparison changes recall. The original visual information was incomplete. The label filled some of the gaps. That is why I try to strip the label away now. What did I actually see? A large, dark, upright form, estimated much taller than me, emerging from trees, two apparent eyes, very little surface detail. Brief duration, shared by one friend, then gone. That is the cleanest version. Once I say it that way, there are many possible explanations. A large person, a person plus elevated ground, a deer standing awkwardly, a bear if the area supported them, an animal overlapping with a tree, a prank, a costume, even some large piece of fabric or landscaping moving in wind, though the eyes make that less satisfying. What I cannot justify is jumping straight to an unknown 10-foot creature. There just is not enough evidence. But I also cannot say with confidence, it was definitely a deer. I did not see antlers. I did not see hooves. I did not see it drop to 4 legs. The ordinary explanations are plausible, not proven. That is why the memory remains unresolved. If we had stayed another 5 seconds, maybe everything would have been obvious. That is the frustrating part. 5 seconds, maybe less. That was all we needed. The figure steps into better light. Human, mystery over. Or it turns sideways. Deer, mystery over. Or we hear a bear sound. Mystery over. Instead, our brains saw a huge unknown thing, and survival instinct ended the observation. We ran before the answer arrived. I cannot blame us. At 15, if you think a 10-foot creature has just come out of the trees 10 or 20 yards away, running feels completely reasonable. Even if the thing is actually an animal, an unknown large animal at close distance is not something you need to approach. We probably made the safest decision, despite losing the evidence. The eyes still bother me when I think about them. Not because they prove anything supernatural. Because eyes make a shape personal. A dark mass can be an object. A dark mass with eyes feels like it is aware of you. I remember feeling watched. That may be partly why the panic was so immediate. Whatever it was did not simply exist. It seemed to be looking back. Again, reflective animal eyes are a very ordinary explanation. In fact, they may be the strongest clue toward an animal. Many animals produce bright eye shine from very weak light. Humans do not have the same effect to the same degree. So if I really saw 2 points of reflected light, animal becomes more likely. Then, the upright appearance needs explaining. A deer raising itself, a bear standing, an animal on higher ground, or simply a misread body angle. Those are all possible. Maybe it was a large buck. At night, antlers and tree branches merge. The animal turns toward us. Eyes reflect. We interpret the antlers and background trunks as a gigantic upright frame. Then it moves out from behind the trees. For 1 second, the whole image looks exactly like a monster. We run. The deer runs the other direction. By the time we return, nothing. That explanation is almost boring enough to be reassuring. But I cannot make my memory of the height agree with it emotionally. It looked huge. That is the part I cannot erase. Still, visual size estimates in darkness are probably the least reliable piece of the whole event. If I am going to question anything, that should be first. There were no measurements, No known object at the same distance. No photograph. No track size. Just a teenager looking at a silhouette. 10 feet may describe how threatening it felt more than how tall it actually was. My friend agreeing with the size does not solve that, because we were standing beside each other and saw the same illusion. If the ground or tree arrangement made it look 10 feet tall, it would look that way to both of us. Shared error is still shared. Another possibility I have considered is a costume. It was 1 in the morning in a neighborhood park. Someone could have been messing around. Maybe a teenager knew people sometimes hung out there late and decided to scare them. A person wearing a large coat, blanket, hood, or costume could produce a Bigfoot-like outline. If they had something raised above their head, they could appear enormous. Maybe they were standing on a stump. Maybe the whole thing was deliberate. Then, when we ran, they left. That would explain no tracks beyond ordinary shoes. It would also explain why nobody else had a story. One prank. One night. Done. The problem is there was no laughter, no pursuit, no reveal. But a prankster does not necessarily have to chase. Maybe seeing us sprint was enough. That explanation is possible. It also has a very human reason for the thing to come out of the trees exactly when we were there. An animal may accidentally appear. A person could intentionally wait. I do not like overcomplicating it, though. There is no evidence anyone planned it. Sometimes weird timing is just weird timing. We also cannot ignore that my friend and I were out at 1 in the morning. We may have been tired. Tired vision is less reliable. Attention gets strange. Peripheral movement is harder to interpret. Dark adaptation is worse if you have been looking at phones or streetlights. Every one of those factors reduces detail. The less detail available, the more the brain fills in, and fear fills in aggressively. That is probably what happened. A real object or animal provided the base. Our brains created the creature. That explanation respects both parts. We did not imagine everything. Something was there. But what we remember may not be an accurate physical portrait. I think that is the most reasonable position. The story also never developed into anything larger. That matters to me a lot. No one else saw a 10-foot creature. No giant tracks were found the next morning. No weird howls started coming from the park. No reports of livestock or pets being attacked. Nothing. If a huge, unknown animal had established itself in a neighborhood park, eventually someone else should notice, especially if it was truly 10 feet tall. A creature that large is difficult to hide in a populated area. It needs food, space, movement. It would cross roads, leave tracks, be seen by drivers. Something. The fact that nothing else happened suggests our size estimate or interpretation was wrong. A normal animal can pass through once and disappear. A person can walk away. A visual illusion exists only from one angle. Those explanations fit the lack of follow-up much better. Sometimes I think our return to the park was actually the closest thing to evidence against our first impression. If we truly saw a huge creature, where did it go so quickly? Of course, a large animal can move fast, but the park was not endless wilderness. You would expect some sign. Instead, total normality. That does not prove anything, but it pushes me away from Bigfoot. The fact that we asked around and got nothing does the same. There was no local pattern for us to accidentally stumble into. No old guy saying he had seen the same thing 20 years earlier. No kid claiming his dog went missing. Nothing. Just us. One night. One shadow. That is usually how misidentifications behave. They happen under specific conditions and never repeat. I still get why people would be skeptical. If someone told me when I was 15 I saw a 10-foot Bigfoot creature in a neighborhood park, I would immediately question the size, the darkness, the distance, the age, the lack of evidence. I would probably suggest a deer, person, or tree shadow. That would be fair. I apply the same skepticism to my own memory. But skepticism does not mean I think nothing happened. I know something scared both of us. I know we saw the same broad shape. That part feels solid. And maybe that is enough. Not every strange experience needs a final creature identification. Sometimes the truth is simply we saw something under conditions too poor to identify it. That is probably what this was. But the memory remains powerful because of the first impression. There are certain images the brain stores whole. I can still picture the tree line, the blackness behind it, that enormous shape separating itself from the trees, the feeling of realizing it was upright. Then the eyes, my friend beside me, and that instant silent agreement between both our bodies that whatever we were looking at was too big and too close. Run, no conversation required. I think that shared panic is what makes the memory stick more than the creature itself. If only I had run, maybe I would doubt myself more. If my friend had stood there laughing, I would assume I saw a shadow. But he ran too. He had his own fear. Later, he gave me essentially the same description. So something about that shape was convincing from both positions. Again, that tells me there was a real trigger. Probably not a mythical creature, but something. I wish we had gone back the next morning instead of only that night. Daylight might have shown us something obvious. A tall, broken tree, a strange stump, a deer trail, a mound that changed the apparent height, a piece of fabric hanging from branches. Maybe the whole mystery would have ended immediately. By the time daylight came, I do not remember whether we bothered. Maybe the fear had become a story already. Maybe there was nothing left to find. That missed daylight investigation is probably my biggest regret. Darkness created the mystery. Daylight was the best chance to destroy it. Instead, the memory stayed frozen in the dark. I am also glad we did not start telling everyone it was definitely Bigfoot. That would have made the story less honest. I still do not say that. I do not know what Bigfoot would even be doing in our neighborhood park. The comparison is only about appearance. Huge, upright, dark, that is it. No ape face, no fur detail, no smell, no vocalization, no footprints, no long observation. Nothing that would justify the label beyond silhouette. That is important. People often take an analogy and turn it into an identification. I saw something Bigfoot-like becomes I saw Bigfoot. Those are not the same statement. Mine stays in the first category. I saw something that in one brief dark moment looked closer to the general idea of Bigfoot than anything else I could name. That is all. If I had to guess today, I would probably put my money on a large animal combined with terrible depth perception and tree shadows. Maybe a deer, maybe something else. Second choice would be a tall person or prankster. Those explanations require no unknown species. They also fit the complete absence of later evidence. But even if one of those is correct, the experience itself was real enough. Two teenagers can be genuinely terrified by a normal animal if they see it under the right conditions. That does not make the story fake. In a way, it makes it more interesting. The world does not need monsters to produce monster-shaped moments. Sometimes darkness does most of the work. A tree line removes detail. A pair of reflective eyes gives the darkness a face. An animal rises at the wrong angle. Your brain combines everything. For 3 seconds, something impossible exists. Then you run. By the time you come back, the pieces have separated again. Trees are trees. Animals are gone. The ground is ordinary. Nothing remains except the image your brain built. That may be exactly what happened to us. And yet, even knowing all of that, I can still remember how small I felt standing there. I was already over 6 feet tall. I was used to being the big person in most situations. Then, something came out of those trees that seemed to tower over me. That reversal may have intensified the fear. If you are normally taller than everyone around you, seeing a figure that appears several feet taller creates an immediate sense that something is wrong. There is no familiar human scale, no normal adult height to compare. Just too big. That was enough. We ran until the park was behind us. We came back searching because we wanted an answer. We found none. We asked around. Nobody else knew anything. Years later, I still do not have anything better than possibilities. A deer, a person, a shadow combined with an animal, a trick of distance, something real seen badly. I am comfortable saying I do not know. I am not comfortable saying nothing was there. My friend saw it too. We both reacted before discussing it. There was something in that tree line. The only question is what our frightened teenage eyes turned it into. Maybe one day, if I stood in the exact same place under the same lighting, I would immediately understand. Maybe there is a rise in the ground that adds several feet to anything standing there. Maybe a particular tree has branches that form huge shoulders. Maybe I would laugh. Maybe I would point and say, that is what we saw. But the version of the park that existed at 1 in the morning when I was 15 is gone now. Even if the trees remain, the moment does not. And without that moment, the creature cannot be recreated. So all I have is the memory. My friend beside me. The dark trees. Something huge stepping out. 2 eyes where a face should have been. And both of us deciding at exactly the same time that whatever it was, we were not staying long enough to find out. I am still not saying it was Bigfoot. I probably never will. But if you ask me what it looked like in those few seconds before we ran, that is still the closest comparison I have. A 10-foot Bigfoot-shaped shadow standing where nothing that large should have been. Then we looked away. And by the time we found the courage to go back, the park had swallowed every answer.
Tonight's stories are over, but darkness has a way of making memories feel closer. Some people never forgot what they saw. Others never learned what was behind the sound, the voice, or the shape waiting just outside the light. Tell me in the comments which story you will be thinking about after this ends. Subscribe to Wickless Night for more true accounts from the hours when no one wants to be awake alone. Sleep carefully, and do not trust every shadow that stays still.